Hi guys, and welcome to America History Tales. Tonight we drift slowly back to the American frontier somewhere in the wide and restless 1880s, where the prairie stretches so far that the horizon seems to breathe. You open your eyes before the sun does. The sky above the plains is still a deep shade of blue that belongs more to night than morning, and the air has that quiet chill that settles over grasslands before dawn. You lie still for a moment inside a simple bedroll spread across the ground. The earth beneath you is firm, slightly cool, and carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifts its weight, and the leather of a saddle creaks softly in the darkness. A few low sounds drift from the herd resting not far away. Hundreds of cattle breathe and shuffle in their sleep like a slow-moving sea made of muscle and horn. And yes, before we go any further, there is something worth mentioning. You probably would not survive this job very long. Not because cowboys spend every day in dramatic gunfights, like the movies suggest, but because the work itself quietly wears people down. Long days in the saddle, unpredictable weather, poor sleep and food that rarely improves beyond beans and coffee. It turns out the Wild West was less about heroic duels and more about sore backs and dust in places you did not know dust could reach. But for now you are here, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, share where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. It is always interesting to see how far these quiet stories travel in the night. Now dim the lights. The prairie is beginning to wake. You sit up slowly, pulling the blanket aside. The air brushes cool against your face, carrying a smell that is difficult to describe but instantly recognizable once you know it. Dust, leather, dry grass, animals, and wood smoke from last night's fire. Cow camp is quiet, but not asleep. A faint glow still lingers in the ashes of the fire pit. Someone must have stirred it during the night because thin threads of smoke drift upward into the dim sky. Nearby, dark shapes of saddled horses stand patiently with their heads lowered. These horses have learned the rhythm of cattle drives just as well as the men who ride them. A historical detail worth remembering is that by the 1880s, the large cattle drives from Texas toward northern railheads had become one of the defining economic activities of the American frontier. Millions of cattle were moved along trails such as the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail, so they could reach railroads that connected the plains to growing cities in the east. But right now you are not thinking about national economics. You are thinking about coffee. A quiet figure already moves near the chuck wagon. The cook, who is often called Cookie, regardless of his actual name, is awake before everyone else. That is the rule of the trail. Cowboys may ride all day, but the cook keeps the entire operation functioning. You walk toward the wagon, slowly, boots pressing softly into the ground. The sky above the prairie is lightening by degrees. A pale silver line has begun to stretch along the eastern horizon. The cook glances up briefly as you approach. He does not say much. Chuck wagon cooks often develop a certain style of communication that relies heavily on grunts and short observations about the weather. A dented metal pot sits over the coals. Coffee, strong enough, according to many trail hands, to wake the dead, and possibly alarm them slightly. You hold out a tin cup, and the cook pours a portion without ceremony. Steam curls upward, carrying a smell that instantly improves the entire morning. You take a careful sip. Hot, bitter, perfect. Nearby, another cowboy emerges from his bedroll, stretching his arms with the stiff movements of someone who spent yesterday riding for 10 hours. He pulls his hat down over messy hair and walks toward the wagon in slow determination. More figures begin rising across camp. There is a quiet choreography to mornings like this. No shouting, no hurry, just a gradual gathering of men who understand that the day ahead will be long. Cowboys in the 1880s were often far younger than people imagine today. Many trail riders were teenagers or men in their early 20s. The work required stamina more than experience, and wages were usually modest, often around $30 to $40 a month. A quirky little detail occasionally mentioned in trail diaries is that some cowboys developed surprisingly elaborate ways of improving their coffee. A few added sugar when they could afford it. Others dropped small bits of burnt bread into the cup, claiming it softened the bitterness. Whether that actually helped is another matter entirely. You take another sip. The sky grows lighter now, shifting from grey to pale gold. Horses begin to stir. One lifts its head and exhales softly through its nose, sending a brief cloud of vapour into the cool air. Another taps a hoof against the ground in quiet impatience. Soon, the herd will move again. But for a few minutes more, the camp remains suspended in this calm space between night and day. You sit on the wagon wheel, warming your hands around the tin cup. The coffee is strong enough to wake every thought in your head. Across the prairie, the herd stretches like a dark blanket scattered across the grass. Even resting cattle never stay completely still. Small movements ripple through the mass. A tail flicks, a head lifts, a low rumble passes from one animal to another. Listening closely, you realize that cattle have a kind of nighttime music. Soft breathing, occasional hoof steps, a long slow exhale that sounds almost like a sigh. Historians still debate exactly how romantic or miserable cowboy life truly was. Some accounts written by former trail riders describe the work with pride and nostalgia. Others remember exhaustion, danger, and loneliness more vividly. Both impressions may be correct. Life on the trail contains moments of surprising peace, like this morning, but also long stretches of demanding labour that slowly grind away your energy. The cook breaks the silence with a quiet announcement, "Breakfast soon," which in cowboy terms usually means beans, biscuits, and maybe a little salt pork if the supplies are holding out. You finish the last of the coffee and set the tin cup back on the wagon. The eastern horizon brightens further now, the first edge of sunlight preparing to climb over the prairie. Another cowboy begins saddling horses. Leather straps tighten. Metal buckles clink softly. One horse snorts and shakes its mane. Soon the calm of morning will give way to movement. Saddles will creak. Riders will spread out along the edges of the herd. Dust will rise again. But right now, you sit quietly on the wagon wheel, watching the world wake slowly around you. The prairie seems endless. The day has not even started yet, and already you suspect it will be a long one. The first sunlight touches the prairie slowly, as if it is unsure whether it wants to wake the world just yet. Pale gold spreads across the tall grass, catching on the backs of cattle and turning the dust in the air into faint glowing ribbons. Cow camp is no longer quiet. Not loud exactly, but awake. Boots press into the ground. Saddles creak. Someone coughs. A horse snorts and shakes its head. The bridle rings chiming softly. The cook moves with steady confidence around the chuck wagon, already sliding biscuits from a cast iron pan, while a pot of beans warms beside the coals. You approach the wagon again, this time with the clear purpose of breakfast. Cowboys do not usually linger long over meals. Eating is practical, fuel for the hours ahead. Still, the smell drifting from the wagon is comforting in a way that surprises you. Beans, salt pork and biscuits. Simple food, but after a night on the ground and a morning in the cold air, it feels like something close to luxury. The cook hands you a tin plate without ceremony. He's already prepared dozens of these meals over the years, perhaps thousands. His movements carry the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that hungry cowboys become impatient cowboys. You sit on an overturned crate near the wagon wheel and begin eating. The biscuits are dense and warm. The beans taste smoky from the fire. The salt pork carries a deep salty richness that makes the whole meal feel heavier than it looks. Nearby, the other men eat in similar silence. One leans against the wagon, chewing slowly. Another sits cross-legged in the dirt, staring toward the herd, as if already thinking about the day's work. A third pours himself another cup of coffee and drinks it in quick, determined gulps. A well-documented historical fact is that the chuck wagon itself was introduced in the late 1860s by a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight. He designed it specifically to support long cattle drives, turning an ordinary wagon into a travelling kitchen stocked with food tools and medical supplies. Without it, cattle drives would have been far more difficult to organise. You glance toward the wagon now with new appreciation. Behind the cook drawers and compartments hold flour sacks, beans, coffee, dried fruit and spices. A hinged board folds down to create a work surface. Even the lid of the wagon chest doubles as a small table when needed. The chuck wagon is not just a kitchen. It is the centre of camp life. A cowboy walking toward the wagon is usually looking for food advice, spare equipment, or sometimes simply a place to sit and think. A curious little detail from trail life is that many chuck wagon cooks guarded their sourdough starters like treasure. These living mixtures of flour and yeast help produce better bread on the trail. Some cooks even named their sourdough cultures and carried them from drive to drive as if they were quiet travelling companions. Whether that habit improved morale or simply amused the cook is difficult to say. You finish the last bite of biscuit and wipe your hands against your trousers. The herd is beginning to stir now. Cattle rise slowly, pushing themselves upright with heavy movements. Some stretch their necks and shake dust from their coats. Others begin wandering in loose circles searching for grass. The time for rest is ending. Across the camp, a cowboy lifts a saddle onto a horse's back with practiced ease. Another checks the straps on his bridle. Horses trained for cattle work often stand patiently during this routine. They know the day will involve long hours but also steady movement, which horses tend to prefer over standing still. You walk toward your horse. The animal raises its head as you approach. Dark eyes watch you carefully, but without concern. This horse has already learned your voice and scent over the past days on the trail. Cowboys and their horses develop strong partnerships, sometimes stronger than the bonds between riders themselves. You run a hand along the horse's neck, brushing away a bit of dust. The coat is warm already despite the cool morning air. Historians continue to discuss how skilled cowboys truly were as horsemen compared to modern riders. Some accounts describe remarkable levels of control and endurance. Other scholars suggest that the practical demands of cattle work simply forced cowboys to become competent riders quickly, whether they intended to or not. Either way, horses were not optional. Without them, the entire cattle drive system would collapse. You lift the saddle and place it carefully onto the horse's back. The leather feels thick and worn, carrying the faint smell of sweat dust and oil from years of use. Saddles on the trail were built to survive long distances, rough terrain, and weather that could change without warning. You tighten the cinch strap slowly. The horse exhales in mild annoyance, but remains still. Horses are not always enthusiastic about this part of the morning. Nearby, one of the cowboys swings easily into his saddle and rides a slow circle around the edge of camp. His horse moves with smooth familiarity, hooves pressing softly into the dirt. Soon others follow. Mounting a horse becomes second nature after enough time on the trail. One hand on the horn, one foot in the stirrup, a quick lift, and suddenly the world is viewed from a slightly higher place. You place your boot into the stirrup and climb into the saddle. For a moment you pause there, adjusting your weight and settling the reins comfortably in your hands. From this height, the prairie looks different. The grass ripples gently in the breeze. The herd stretches across the land like a living blanket of movement. Dust lifts slowly from hooves as the cattle begin drifting into loose clusters. Morning has fully arrived now. The sun climbs above the horizon and light spreads across the plains in wide golden sheets. One of the cowboys rides past you and nods toward the herd. Time to move them. Cowboys on cattle drives typically spread themselves along the sides and rear of the herd. A few riders guide the leaders at the front, encouraging them toward the day's direction of travel. Others keep watch along the edges to prevent cattle from wandering too far. It is less like commanding an army and more like gently persuading a very large and stubborn group of animals to move together. You guide your horse forward. The animal responds with quiet willingness, stepping through the grass toward the herd. The smell of cattle grows stronger as you approach. Warm animal scent mixed with earth and dust. The first cattle lift their heads as riders appear around them. Some begin walking immediately. Others hesitate before following. Movement spreads slowly through the herd, one small shift, encouraging another, until hundreds of animals begin drifting in the same direction. Hooves rustle through the grass. Dust begins rising again. The day's work has begun, and you have barely travelled a mile yet. The herd moves slowly at first, like a heavy thought that has not fully decided to become action. A few cattle step forward, then a few more, and gradually the entire mass begins drifting across the prairie. From a distance, it might look calm and effortless. From inside the movement, it feels more like guiding a restless tide. You ride along the edge of the herd, keeping your horse at a steady walk. The rhythm of the saddle begins to settle into your body again. Leather creaks quietly with each step. Dust rises from hooves and hangs in the air, glowing softly in the morning sun. The smell of cattle becomes stronger now. It is not exactly unpleasant, but it is powerful. Warm animal breath, dry grass, and the sharp scent of manure combine into something that belongs entirely to the open range. You begin noticing the other riders more clearly. Until now, they have mostly been shapes, moving around camp figures defined by hats and silhouettes in the early light. But as the herd spreads out and the riders take their positions, personalities begin to appear. One cowboy rides near the front of the herd. His posture is relaxed in a way that suggests long experience. He does not hurry his horse and he rarely speaks. Yet when he moves, the cattle seem to notice. Another rider lingers farther back, quietly watching for stragglers. He hums to himself now and then, low and almost absent-minded, as if the song is meant more for the cattle than for anyone else. Cowboys sometimes sing while riding herd. The steady sound helps calm nervous cattle and also passes the time during long hours in the saddle. A widely recognised historical detail is that many cowboys of the 1880s came from surprisingly varied backgrounds. While popular stories often focus on white American riders, a significant number of cowboys were African American, Mexican, or of mixed heritage. Some historians estimate that nearly 1/4 of working cowboys during this period were black, many of them formerly enslaved men who found employment in the cattle industry after the Civil War. Riding beside you now might be men from Texas, Kansas, Mexico, or even farther away. Out here, skill with cattle matters far more than where someone was born. You notice the quiet hierarchy forming along the herd. The trail boss rides slightly ahead of everyone else. He is not shouting orders constantly. In fact, he rarely raises his voice at all. But when he turns his horse, or signals with a small movement of his hand, the other riders adjust their positions almost immediately. Authority on the trail tends to be calm rather than loud. Behind him rides the point rider guiding the leaders of the herd. This job requires patience because cattle rarely move in perfectly straight lines. They drift toward grass, wander toward water, and occasionally decide that walking in the opposite direction is the best possible idea. Your job today seems to place you somewhere along the side of the herd. This position is called riding the swing. Swing riders help keep the herd from spreading too wide. They guide wandering cattle gently back toward the main body of animals. It is a job that requires attention but not constant urgency. You watch how the more experienced cowboys handle it. One rider notices a small group of steers drifting too far from the herd. He does not chase them immediately. Instead, he angles his horse slowly toward their path, creating a quiet pressure that encourages the animals to turn back on their own. The steers hesitate, then adjust direction. Problem solved without excitement. Historians still discuss how much of cowboy skill came from formal training versus simple observation. Many young riders learn the work by watching older cowboys and copying their techniques. There were few written instructions and no official schools for cattle driving. The prairie itself became the classroom. You try guiding your horse in a similar way. A single steer has begun drifting toward a patch of thicker grass. You turn slightly in the saddle and ease your horse into its path. The horse seems to understand the intention even before you fully commit to the movement. Working horses often learn cattle behavior so well that they react almost automatically. The steer notices you approaching. After a moment, it turns and rejoins the herd. You feel a small flicker of satisfaction. Nearby, another cowboy glances over and nods once, a silent acknowledgement that you handled the moment correctly. Cowboy conversation tends to be economical. Words are used when necessary, but much communication happens through gestures, nods, or simply shared understanding. A curious little detail recorded in some trail journals is that cowboys occasionally developed nicknames for particularly troublesome cattle. A stubborn steer might be referred to by name for weeks, earning a reputation among the riders, as if it were a difficult co-worker rather than livestock. Whether the cattle appreciated these titles is impossible to say. The herd continues moving across the prairie. Hooves create a constant rustling sound as they press through grass and soil. It's not loud enough to overwhelm conversation, but it forms a steady background rhythm that never quite disappears. Dust drifts around your boots and rises into the air with every step the cattle take. You shift slightly in the saddle. Even after only a short time riding this morning, you can already feel the slow strain settling into your muscles. Cowboy work rarely demands sudden bursts of dramatic action. Instead, it asks for endurance, hour after hour of controlled movement. The sun climbs higher. Warmth begins spreading across the plains, replacing the cool air of dawn. Jackets come off. Hats tilt slightly lower to shade the eyes. One of the riders near the rear of the herd begins humming again. The tune is soft and repetitive, drifting over the cattle like a quiet breeze. Some scholars believe these trail songs evolved naturally from a mixture of folk music work chants and simple improvisation. Cowboys often changed the words or melodies as they rode, creating songs that were less about performance and more about passing time. Listening to the humming now, you realise something. The herd moves more calmly when the sound continues. Perhaps the cattle interpret it as a signal that nothing unusual is happening. Or perhaps the rhythm simply blends with the steady movement of hooves and breathing. Either way, the prairie settles into a strange kind of harmony. Horse steps, cattle movement, dust drifting in sunlight, a quiet human voice repeating the same gentle melody. You ride along the herd's edge, watching for wandering animals. The work is slow, patient, and oddly hypnotic. And the morning has only just begun. The prairie continues unfolding ahead of you in wide, patient silence as the herd drifts forward. From a distance, The cattle appear almost peaceful, moving in a broad dark ribbon across the grasslands. But up close, you begin to understand that guiding hundreds of animals requires a constant kind of attention. Cattle are not predictable creatures. Some walk steadily following the animal ahead of them without question. Others pause suddenly, turning their heads to inspect a clump of grass, as if it has presented an important philosophical problem. A few drift sideways for reasons known only to themselves. You ride slowly along the flank of the herd, watching. At first, the animals look nearly identical. Dusty coats, long faces, slow steps. But as the morning stretches on, small differences begin to appear. One steer walks with a slight limp. Another carries horns that curve outward, like wide crescent moons. A third seems permanently suspicious, lifting its head every few minutes to stare toward the riders. Learning to notice these details is part of the job. Veteran cowboys develop an ability to read cattle behavior almost instinctively. They notice shifts in movement, small signs of agitation, the subtle tightening of a herd before something unsettles them. Modern historians often note that cattle driving demanded more observation than force. Successful cowboys relied less on shouting and more on careful positioning, guiding animals through pressure and space rather than aggression. You watch one of the experienced riders demonstrate this quietly. A small cluster of steers begins drifting toward the outer edge of the herd. The cowboy does not rush them. Instead, he angles his horse in a wide arc, gradually placing himself where the cattle would prefer not to go. The animals slow. One lifts its head, considering the new obstacle. Then, as if reconsidering a questionable decision, the group turns gently back toward the main body of the herd. Problem solved. You try to imitate the technique. Another steer wanders a few steps too far from the herd. You guide your horse into its path, keeping your movements slow and calm. The steer hesitates. For a moment it looks directly at you, its dark eyes reflecting the bright morning light. Then it turns and walks back toward the others. Your horse exhales softly beneath you, almost as if acknowledging the small success. Working horses on the frontier were often trained to handle cattle with remarkable sensitivity. Many learned to anticipate sudden movements and could pivot quickly to block a running steer. Riders sometimes said their horses understood cattle nearly as well as the cowboys themselves. A lesser known detail from ranch records reveals that certain horses became famous among cowboys for their intelligence. Some riders even refused to trade horses for higher wages, preferring to keep the animal they trusted most. You pat your horse lightly along the neck. The animal flicks one ear back toward you, acknowledging the touch, before returning its attention to the herd. The sun continues climbing into the sky. Morning warmth spreads across the plains, carrying with it the steady smell of dust and animals. The herd moves in a slow current of motion. Hooves press into the soil. Grass bends beneath heavy bodies. The rhythm becomes strangely calming. Hours of cattle driving often pass in quiet observation. A cowboy's job is not constant excitement. Instead, it resembles long stretches of watchfulness interrupted by brief moments of action. One rider near the rear of the herd suddenly whistles, not loudly, just enough to catch attention. You glance back. A young steer has begun trotting nervously, weaving through the herd. The movement spreads quickly. Several nearby cattle lift their heads, unsettled by the sudden energy. Moments like this matter. If too many animals become nervous at once, the entire herd can begin to panic. A stampede can start from surprisingly small disturbances. You guide your horse closer. The nervous steer continues weaving, bumping against another animal. Dust rises around their hooves. Before the tension grows further, one of the experienced riders moves forward. His horse glides into position beside the restless steer. The rider speaks softly, almost conversationally. Easy now. The tone of his voice seems oddly important. The steer slows. Within seconds, the nervous movement fades, absorbed back into the slow rhythm of the herd. Several cattle lower their heads again and resume grazing as they walk. Cowboys learn quickly that calm voices and patient riding often prevent trouble before it begins. Researchers who study cattle behaviour today sometimes observe that livestock respond strongly to consistent patterns of sound and movement. A familiar voice or steady rhythm can reassure animals more effectively than sudden force. Watching the herd settle, you begin to understand why experienced riders move the way they do. Every motion is deliberate. Every sound carries weight. A curious observation, recorded in a few trail journals, mentions that some cowboys believed cattle could recognize individual riders. Whether that belief was scientifically accurate remains uncertain, but many riders insisted certain animals reacted differently depending on who approached them. Perhaps the cattle simply learned familiar shapes and habits. Or perhaps they understood more than anyone realized. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead. Your horse walks steadily beneath you, hooves brushing through tall grass. A light breeze moves across the plains, carrying faint rustling sounds from distant patches of vegetation. The herd flows forward like a slow river of muscle and horn. Watching it now, you realize something important. Driving cattle is not about forcing animals across the land. It is about understanding them. You read their movements, anticipate their decisions, guide them gently away from trouble before trouble begins. The work is quite thoughtful and strangely absorbing, and as the herd continues drifting across the sunlit prairie, you begin to feel the rhythm of it settling deeper into your bones. The herd settles into a rhythm that begins to feel almost hypnotic. Hundreds of cattle move forward in a slow rolling wave across the prairie. Their hooves press into the dry soil with soft, steady sounds that blend together like distant rain. Dust rises in light clouds and drifts lazily through the warm air. You ride along the flank of the herd, keeping your horse at an easy walk. The saddle creaks gently beneath you with each step. At first the motion feels slightly awkward, but after enough time the body begins to adjust. Your muscles relax into the movement, rising and falling with the horse as naturally as breathing. This is the true pace of a cattle drive. Not the dramatic galloping chases shown in old Western films, but hours and hours of controlled patience. Cowboys often travelled only 10 to 15 miles in a full day, guiding the herd slowly, so the animals would not lose weight before reaching the railheads where they would be sold. The work is less about speed and more about consistency. The sun climbs higher, bright and steady above the open land. Morning coolness fades, replaced by a gentle warmth that spreads across the plains. The breeze carries the scent of crushed grass and cattle. You glance across the herd again. At this distance, the animals blend together into a moving landscape. Horns catch the sunlight. Tails flick lazily at flies. Occasionally a steer lifts its head and lets out a low echoing call that rolls across the prairie. One of the riders farther ahead adjusts his position slightly, guiding a small group of animals back toward the centre. His movements are slow and deliberate. Watching him, you begin to realise that cattle driving has a rhythm not unlike rowing a boat or walking a long trail. The body repeats the same motions over and over again until the work becomes almost automatic. A well-documented historical observation is that many cowboys spent more than half their waking hours in the saddle during cattle drives. Days often began before sunrise and continued until evening with only brief pauses for meals or water. After several weeks of this routine, even experienced riders sometimes developed aching knees and stiff backs. You shift slightly in your saddle, already aware of a small soreness forming in your hips. Your horse flicks its tail again, swatting away a determined cloud of flies. Insects are constant companions on the open range. Flies buzz around the cattle and occasionally wander toward the riders as well. The cattle react with irritated tail swishes and sudden head shakes, but they rarely break their steady forward pace. Nearby, one of the cowboys lifts a hand to adjust his hat. The brim casts a deep shadow across his face, hiding his eyes from the glare of the sun. Hats are more than just style out here. They protect against heat, rain, wind and dust, all of which can arrive without much warning on the plains. An interesting little detail appears in several surviving trail journals. Some cowboys reportedly developed personal ways of shaping their hat brims, bending them upward or downward depending on preference. These shapes sometimes became recognizable signatures among the crew. Whether the hats actually improved comfort or simply gave riders a sense of individuality is open to interpretation. The herd continues its slow march across the grasslands. You begin noticing how the sound changes depending on where you ride. Near the edge of the herd, the noise is softer. Hooves brushing grass, the occasional snort from a steer, the quiet creak of saddle leather. Deeper inside the herd, the sound grows heavier, a dense mixture of breathing hooves and low rumbling calls. The prairie itself remains vast and mostly empty. Occasionally you spot distant patches of shrubs or small rises in the land, but for long stretches the horizon remains wide and uninterrupted. Time begins to feel strange in places like this. Minutes stretch quietly into half hours fade into long segments of riding that seem to blend together. Without clocks or towns or regular landmarks, the day unfolds according to sunlight and movement rather than precise numbers. You glance toward the trail boss riding ahead. He sits comfortably in the saddle, watching the herd with an expression that suggests deep concentration mixed with patience. Leading a cattle drive requires constant planning. The boss must decide when to stop for water, where to camp, and how far the herd can travel without exhausting the animals. Some historians continue to discuss how stressful this responsibility could be. If the cattle lost weight, wandered off, or became injured during the drive, the financial losses could be significant for the ranch that owned them. For the riders, however, the focus remains simple. Keep the herd moving. Keep it calm. Keep it together. A small movement near the rear catches your eye. One of the younger steers begins trotting slightly faster than the others, kicking up extra dust as it moves forward. The sudden energy spreads through a few nearby cattle. You guide your horse gently toward the disturbance. Your horse steps lightly through the grass, closing the distance without rushing. As you approach, the restless steer glances toward you and slows slightly. That is often enough. The animal merges back into the steady flow of the herd. The prairie returns to its quiet rhythm. A light breeze moves across the land again, rustling the tall grass in soft waves. For a moment, the entire landscape seems to breathe. You settle deeper into the saddle. The long hours ahead feel less intimidating now that the rhythm of the trail has begun to settle around you. The herd moves. The horse walks. The sun climbs slowly across the sky. And somewhere in that steady motion, the day begins to drift quietly forward. By the time the sun climbs higher into the open sky, the quiet coolness of morning has fully disappeared. Warmth spreads steadily across the plains, and the soft breeze that felt pleasant earlier now carries dry heat with it. You begin to understand that riding a horse all day is not quite the romantic image people imagine. Your legs rest against the horse's sides, absorbing the slow motion of every step. The saddle that felt comfortable at sunrise now presses more firmly beneath you. Your back straightens again and again, trying to find the easiest position, but the rhythm of the horse never truly stops. Hour after hour of riding begins to introduce itself slowly into your muscles. The herd moves forward at the same patient pace. Cattle lower their heads occasionally to pull mouthfuls of grass before continuing, Dust lifts from their hooves and hangs in the sunlight like thin drifting clouds. You wipe a sleeve across your forehead. The air smells warmer now. Dry grass, warm leather cattle and dust blend into the particular scent of a summer cattle drive. The prairie stretches endlessly in every direction. In the distance, you see faint shapes of low hills and scattered shrubs, but nothing large enough to break the horizon. The sky above feels enormous, a vast dome of blue that presses gently down over the land. A widely accepted historical fact about cowboy life is that it demanded enormous physical endurance. Riders sometimes spent 8 to 12 hours in the saddle each day, during a drive repeating the same steady motions for weeks at a time. While the work rarely required bursts of strength, it demanded stamina that slowly tested even experienced cowboys. You shift again in the saddle. Your horse flicks an ear backward briefly, acknowledging the movement. Working horses were chosen carefully by ranchers for their durability. Many cattle horses were not especially tall or dramatic looking. Instead, they were compact, strong animals capable of travelling long distances without tiring quickly. Your horse continues walking calmly through the grass. The herd rustles ahead of you like a living tide. One of the riders on the far side of the cattle raises a hand briefly, signalling that everything remains under control on his flank. Small gestures like this pass information quietly across the herd without disturbing the animals. Communication on the trail often happens without words. You notice another rider pull a bandana from around his neck and wipe dust from his face. The cloth returns to its position, quickly protecting his mouth and nose from the drifting dirt stirred by hundreds of hooves. A curious detail sometimes mentioned in old trail accounts is that cowboys developed creative ways of dealing with dust during long drives. Some riders dampened their bandanas slightly in the morning, believing the moisture helped filter the air. Others simply accepted that dust was part of daily life and stopped noticing it after a few weeks. Looking at the haze drifting around the herd, now you suspect the second approach was probably more common. The heat continues building slowly. Sunlight reflects from the backs of the cattle, turning their coats into patches of moving bronze and brown. Flies circle lazily around the herd, buzzing impatient loops, before settling again on warm animal hides. The cattle respond with constant tail swishes and occasional irritated snorts. Your horse swats its tail as well, clearly sharing the cattle's opinion of insects. You glance toward the trail boss again. He studies the land ahead carefully. The route of a cattle drive was rarely random. Trail bosses often plan their path around water sources, patches of good grass, and safe crossings of rivers or creeks. Some researchers studying old cattle trails have noted that experienced trail bosses possessed impressive mental maps of the frontier. Without detailed printed maps or modern navigation tools, they relied on memory landmarks and experience gathered over many seasons. Watching him now, you see him scanning the horizon with calm attention. The herd continues its steady progress behind him. Hours begin to slip quietly past. The sun climbs higher and the prairie brightens until the entire landscape glows with a pale golden haze. Heat shimmers above the ground in faint wavering lines. You begin to feel the dryness in your throat. Fortunately, cattle drives included regular pauses for water whenever streams or watering holes appeared along the route. Dehydrated cattle lose weight quickly, which ranchers wanted to avoid before selling them. One of the riders behind you begins humming again, the same slow melody drifting across the herd. The tune carries easily in the open air, rising and falling with the rhythm of the horse beneath him. Songs on the trail often change from day to day. Some were borrowed from folk traditions, others were invented spontaneously during long hours of riding. A few lines might repeat endlessly while riders quietly altered the words to suit the moment. The cattle seem content with the sound. Their pace remains slow and steady. Your own breathing settles into the rhythm of the saddle again. The discomfort in your muscles does not disappear, but it becomes something manageable, another quiet part of the day's work. Scholars who study frontier labour sometimes point out that cowboy life was less about heroic adventure and more about persistence. The romantic image of the lone gunslinger rarely matched the reality of dusty days, aching bodies, and patient observation of livestock. Looking around now, you can see why. The prairie remains vast and mostly silent. The herd moves slowly. The riders guide them with quiet attention. There are no dramatic gunfights, no cheering crowds, no cinematic music rising in the background. Just sunlight, dust, and the steady creak of saddles. You sit in the saddle, watching the cattle drift forward across the endless grass. And you realise the day is still only half begun. By the time the sun begins leaning towards the middle of the sky, the herd's pace slows naturally. Even cattle that have walked patiently for hours begin to show small signs of fatigue. Heads dip lower, steps shorten. The great moving blanket of animals spreads wider across the prairie. The trail boss raises one hand. It is a small gesture, but every rider understands it. Time to pause. You guide your horse gradually toward a slower walk as the herd begins settling into the grass. Cattle lower their heads almost immediately, tearing mouthfuls of prairie grass with steady enthusiasm. The rustling sound spreads across the field like quiet rain falling through dry leaves. Dust begins to settle. The prairie feels calmer now. Your horse seems relieved as well. The animal lowers its head briefly, stretching its neck before standing quietly in the warm sunlight. Hours of steady walking affect horses just as much as riders. You swing your leg over the saddle and slide down to the ground. For a moment your legs feel strangely unsteady, as if they have forgotten how to stand still. Many cowboys joked that after a full day of riding, walking felt like learning a new skill all over again. You take a few steps through the grass, letting your muscles stretch. The air feels warmer now. Noon approaches and the prairie sun shines with steady confidence overhead. A light breeze moves through the tall grass, carrying the mixed scent of earth cattle and sun-warmed plants. Nearby, several riders dismount as well. One removes his hat and wipes his forehead with a sleeve. Another walks slowly toward the chuck wagon, which has already been pulled into position during the herd's pause. The cook works with quiet determination beside the wagon. Lunch on the trail is rarely elaborate, but it is dependable. Cowboys gather near the wagon in small groups, accepting tin plates filled with simple food. Today it appears to be beans again, along with slices of bread and perhaps a bit of dried meat. You approach the wagon and accept a plate. The cook nods once, without much conversation. Chuck wagon cooks were known for being practical people. Their responsibility involved feeding a group of hungry riders every day, while managing limited supplies that had to last for weeks. An established historical observation about trail life is that chuck wagon cooks often held more authority than newcomers expected. Cowboys respected the cook because he controlled the food supply and maintained order around camp. Annoying the cook was widely considered a poor decision. You sit on a patch of grass with your plate. The beans taste smoky again, warmed over the small fire. The bread is simple but filling. After a morning of riding, the meal feels far more satisfying than it might in a comfortable kitchen. Around you, the other cowboys eat quietly. Conversations drift slowly through the warm air. Someone mentions a stretch of rough weather they encountered on a previous drive. Another rider complains lightly about a stubborn steer that kept wandering away earlier in the morning. Laughter appears occasionally, brief and relaxed. Life on the trail does not provide many opportunities for long social gatherings, but these short pauses become important moments of rest. You glance toward the herd. Cattle remain scattered across the grass, chewing steadily. Their bodies move slowly as they graze, spreading outward in loose clusters. Trail bosses usually allowed the herd to rest and feed during midday whenever conditions allowed. Allowing cattle to graze helped maintain their strength during the long journey north. Some researchers studying cattle drives have pointed out that managing grazing time was essential for keeping the animals healthy enough to reach market. Watching the herd, now you can see why. Hundreds of animals bend their heads into the grass, tearing steady mouthfuls as if the prairie itself was slowly disappearing beneath them. One of the cowboys nearby finishes his meal and leans back onto his elbows. The sun shines directly above now, bright but not yet overwhelming. He pulls a small pouch from his pocket and begins rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. A curious habit occasionally described in trail memoirs involved cowboys saving small bits of tobacco very carefully. Supplies could run low during long drives, and riders sometimes traded tobacco almost like currency within the crew. Whether the tobacco improved morale or simply gave riders something to focus on during quiet moments is difficult to measure. The cowboy lights the cigarette and exhales slowly. A thin ribbon of smoke drifts upward and disappears into the warm air. You finish your meal and stretch your legs again. Your horse stands a short distance away, lowering its head to nibble at the grass. Saddled horses often remained ready even during short breaks, since gathering them again could take time if they wandered too far. One rider begins telling a quiet story about a drive from several years earlier. His voice carries just far enough for a few nearby cowboys to hear. The story involves a storm, a frightened herd, and a night ride that apparently lasted until sunrise. Details grow slightly more dramatic with each sentence. Scholars examining cowboy folklore have often pointed out that trail stories tended to grow more colourful over time. A difficult experience might become an adventure in later retellings, while a minor inconvenience could transform into a legendary struggle against nature. Listening to the story, now you suspect the truth lies somewhere between reality and memory. The prairie breeze moves through the grass again. Cattle chew slowly. The horses rest. The riders sit quietly in scattered patches of shade created by their own hats. For a few peaceful minutes, the endless rhythm of the cattle drive pauses. Soon the herd will rise again. The saddles will creak. Dust will return to the air. But right now, beneath the steady sun of the prairie, you sit in the grass and let the quiet moment settle around you. The quiet rest on the prairie does not last forever. It rarely does on a cattle drive. After a short while, the trail boss rises slowly from where he has been sitting near the chuck wagon. He studies the herd for a moment, watching the cattle graze and spread across the grassland. The animals have eaten well during the break, but allowing them to wander too far would make gathering them again unnecessarily difficult. He lifts his hat slightly, a small signal that the pause is coming to an end. Cowboys begin standing again, brushing grass and dust from their trousers. Tin plates are returned to the wagon, and the cook begins cleaning the small collection of utensils with practiced efficiency. You stretch your legs one last time before walking back toward your horse. The animal lifts its head from the grass as you approach. Its ears twitch forward, recognizing the familiar routine. Even horses learn the schedule of a cattle drive after a few days. Rest never lasts long. You place a hand on the saddle horn and swing yourself back into the seat. The leather feels warm now after sitting under the midday sun. Around you, the other riders mount their horses as well. One cowboy adjusts the strap beneath his saddle. Another tightens the bandana around his neck to block the dust that will soon return. The chuck wagon is already moving again. Despite appearing simple, the wagon plays a surprisingly complex role in life on the trail. It carries food, cooking equipment, spare tools, medical supplies, and sometimes even a few personal belongings for the cowboys. Many historians consider the chuck wagon one of the most important inventions in the cattle drive system. Its design allowed crews to travel for weeks across remote land without relying on towns or permanent settlements. You glance back towards the wagon as the cook climbs onto the driver's seat. Behind him, the wagon box holds carefully organised compartments filled with flour sacks, coffee tins, beans, dried fruit, and cooking pans. Every item has a place because space is limited. Without this rolling kitchen feeding a dozen hungry riders day after day would be nearly impossible. The cook cracks the reins gently, and the wagon horses begin pulling the vehicle forward along a faint trail through the grass. Meanwhile, the herd begins gathering itself again. Cattle lift their heads from the grass and shuffle slowly into motion. Some resist at first, clearly enjoying their meal, but riders guide them gently back toward the main group. Dust returns quickly once the hooves begin moving. You guide your horse along the side of the herd again, watching for animals that drift too far away. The afternoon sun feels stronger now. Heat settles across the prairie in a quiet wave. The air grows slightly heavier, and the breeze fades to a soft whisper through the grass. Your horse steps steadily forward. The herd resumes its slow march. One of the cowboys riding nearby glances toward the chuck wagon and smiles faintly. Trail crews often developed a strange kind of loyalty toward their cook. The cook did not ride herd, but his responsibilities were just as demanding. He woke before dawn, prepared every meal, repaired equipment when possible, and sometimes even acted as an informal medic if someone was injured. In many ways, the cook served as the quiet centre of camp life. An interesting observation appears in several old ranch diaries. Some cooks became legendary figures among cowboys, remembered not just for their cooking, but for their sharp personalities. A cook who could prepare decent biscuits and maintain order around the wagon earned lasting respect. A cook with a bad temper, however, could become equally memorable for entirely different reasons. You imagine the long hours he spends alone while the riders guide the herd across the plains. The wagon usually travels ahead of the cattle, so the cook can reach the next camp location early and prepare supper before the herd arrives. It is a lonely job in its own way. Your attention returns to the herd. Cattle move more slowly in the heat of afternoon. Their steps remain steady, but the energy from earlier in the morning has faded. This slower pace actually works in the crew's favour. A calm herd is less likely to panic. Some researchers who study cattle drives note that experienced cowboys preferred predictable routines for this reason. Consistency helped keep both riders and livestock relaxed during long journeys. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead once again. You shift slightly in the saddle. The small soreness from earlier riding has settled deeper into your muscles now. It is not unbearable, but it reminds you that the day is far from finished. A few riders exchange quiet remarks as they guide their horses along the herd. Conversation remains casual. One cowboy mentions a town several days ahead where the crew might stop briefly once the herd reaches a railhead. Another rider jokes about the quality of saloon whiskey waiting there. The thought of town life brings a small spark of anticipation. Even the quietest cowboy looks forward to stepping off the trail for a short while after weeks of dust and open sky. Yet that moment remains far away. Right now, the only sounds are hooves, wind, and the low murmurs of cattle moving through the grass. The chuck wagon rolls steadily along the distant trail. The riders spread themselves carefully around the herd. The afternoon stretches forward with calm patience. And once again, the prairie returns to its slow, endless rhythm. The afternoon light begins to soften slightly as the sun drifts westward across the sky. The heat does not vanish, but it settles into something less sharp than the blazing hours of midday. The prairie glows in shades of gold and pale green, stretching far beyond the slow-moving herd. You ride along the flank again, letting your horse keep its steady walking pace. By now, the rhythm of the day has become familiar. The horse steps forward. The cattle drift along. Dust rises and falls like quiet breath above the land. The trail boss continues watching the horizon. Weather on the plains can change quickly, and experienced riders learn to read small signs in the sky. You follow his gaze and notice something new forming in the distance. Far to the north, a band of darker clouds stretches low across the horizon. They are thin at first, almost easy to ignore. But as the herd continues forward, the line of grey begins to widen and climb slowly upward into the blue sky, into the hops. A commonly recorded historical reality of cattle drives is that weather posed one of the greatest challenges for trail crews. Sudden storms could scatter cattle flood rivers or turn dry ground into thick mud that slowed travel dramatically. Cowboys learn to pay close attention to the sky. You notice one of the riders tilt his hat back slightly as he studies the clouds. The prairie wind shifts just a little. It is subtle, but the air carries a cooler edge than before. The grass bends gently in a new direction. Even the horses seem to notice lifting their heads more frequently. The herd continues moving, though a few cattle begin glancing around with mild uncertainty. Animals often sense changes in weather earlier than people do. Your horse exhales quietly as it walks. The chuck wagon rolls steadily along the distant trail, its wheels leaving faint tracks through the grass. The cook sits upright on the seat, guiding the wagon team forward with calm patience. An interesting observation preserved in a number of trail accounts suggests that cowboys often developed strong instincts about approaching storms. Some riders claimed they could smell rain hours before it arrived, detecting faint shifts in humidity carried by the wind. Whether that ability came from experience or imagination is difficult to confirm, but many cowboys believed it. You breathe in slowly. The air does feel slightly different now, less dusty perhaps, a hint of moisture hidden somewhere far away. The herd rustles as it continues forward. Cattle prefer routine, and the steady pace of the drive helps keep them calm even when weather begins changing. Still, the riders grow more attentive. Small disturbances matter more when storms approach. The trail boss signals quietly to one of the riders ahead. They exchange a few brief words before the rider moves forward along the front of the herd, guiding the lead animal slightly toward a patch of lower land where the grass appears thicker. Experienced trail bosses often adjusted routes when weather threatened. Open prairie offered little protection from wind or lightning, but small changes in terrain sometimes provided safer ground. Your horse steps carefully through a patch of uneven grass. The herd begins spreading slightly as it follows the new direction. Riders reposition themselves along the edges, maintaining the wide circle of quiet guidance that keeps the cattle moving together. A low rumble drifts across the distant sky. You pause for a moment listening. Thunder. Still far away but unmistakable. The clouds on the northern horizon continue thickening, growing darker as they spread across the sky. Sunlight fades slightly beneath the expanding grey. Several cattle lift their heads and look toward the horizon. Their ears twitch. Livestock often react nervously to thunder. Loud sounds can travel across the plains for miles, startling animals long before a storm actually arrives. One rider near the rear of the herd begins humming again, the soft melody floating through the air. Songs and quiet voices sometimes help calm restless cattle during uncertain moments. The steady sound reassures them that nothing unusual is happening. The herd continues walking. Your horse flicks its tail again, as flies buzz lazily around its flanks. The wind strengthens slightly. Grass bends in gentle waves across the prairie. Dust lifts and drifts in thin ribbons before settling again. You glance once more at the sky. The storm still appears distant, but its presence grows more obvious with each passing minute. Some researchers studying cattle drive records suggest that storm management was one of the most stressful aspects of the job. Rain itself was not always dangerous, but lightning, strong wind and sudden thunder could spook an entire herd into panic. A frightened herd of cattle could become extremely difficult to control. For now, though, the prairie remains calm. The herd moves steadily. The riders guide them with quiet patience. Far away, the storm gathers its strength, building slowly along the wide horizon. And you continue riding beneath the fading afternoon sun, aware that the peaceful rhythm of the trail may soon face a very different test. The sky changes slowly at first, almost politely, as if giving the prairie time to notice. The distant band of grey clouds grows thicker, climbing upward and spreading across the horizon like ink drifting through water. Sunlight fades just enough to soften the colour of the grass. The herd continues moving, but the mood across the range has shifted. You feel it in the wind. The air grows cooler, carrying a restless energy that was not present earlier. The breeze brushes across the prairie in longer strokes, now pushing waves through the tall grass. Your horse lifts its head slightly. Animals sense these changes with quiet sensitivity. Ahead of you, several cattle pause their grazing and stare toward the distant clouds. Their ears twitch, catching sounds too faint for you to hear yet. Another roll of thunder drifts across the sky, still distant but closer than before. One of the cowboys near the front of the herd raises his voice slightly, calling to another rider along the opposite flank. The words are brief, carried away quickly by the wind. Riders begin adjusting their positions. The circle around the herd tightens. A widely recognised historical reality of cattle drives is that storms posed one of the most serious dangers on the open plains. Sudden thunder or lightning could frighten cattle into a stampede, sending hundreds or even thousands of animals running blindly across the land. Stopping a stampede was one of the most difficult tasks a cowboy might face. You guide your horse closer to the herd. The animals begin bunching together slightly as the wind strengthens. Their movement grows less relaxed. Heads lift more frequently. Hooves shuffle through the grass with nervous energy. Dust swirls upward in thin spirals. The riders respond quietly. Instead of shouting or rushing, they begin spreading out carefully, maintaining a steady presence around the cattle. Horses move in slow arcs, positioning themselves where wandering animals might try to escape. The goal is simple: keep the herd calm. A small group of steers suddenly shifts direction, trotting nervously toward the edge of the herd. You steer your horse into their path, guiding them gently back toward the centre. Your horse moves quickly but smoothly, blocking their route without causing alarm. The steers hesitate. After a moment, they return to the slow-moving herd. Nearby, another cowboy rides along the outer edge, speaking softly in a low, steady tone. Easy now. The sound blends with the rising wind. Researchers who examine livestock behaviour often note that cattle respond strongly to sudden noise or unfamiliar motion. Calm voices and predictable movement can help prevent panic during tense moments. Watching the older riders work, you realise how deliberate their actions are. Every movement is controlled. Every decision is measured. Lightning flashes far across the prairie. The bright streak appears briefly behind the distant clouds, illuminating the darkening sky. Several cattle flinch. The thunder follows a few seconds later, louder this time. The herd shifts uneasily. Hooves stamp against the ground. Dust rises again as animals push closer together. Your heart beats slightly faster. This is how trouble begins. One nervous animal runs. Another follows. Then the entire herd can explode into motion. The riders know this. They move even more carefully now, guiding their horses into positions that create a quiet barrier around the cattle. One cowboy begins singing softly. The melody is slow and steady, drifting through the wind like a calm conversation. Another rider joins him, humming along in a low voice. Songs often serve practical purposes on cattle drives. Riders use them to soothe restless animals during night watches or during storms when tension filled the air. The herd listens. Whether the cattle recognize the rhythm or simply respond to the steady sound is uncertain, but the animals remain mostly calm. A curious story appears in several cowboy memoirs describing a steer that once led a nighttime stampede after being startled by lightning. According to the riders, that particular animal developed such a reputation that cowboys jokingly blamed it for every nervous movement in the herd afterward. Like many trail stories, the truth behind the tale probably grew more colourful with each retelling. The wind continues building across the plains. Grass bends deeply now, brushing against the legs of the cattle as they move. The sky darkens slightly beneath the spreading clouds. Thunder rumbles again, rolling across the land like distant wagon wheels. Historians still debate how frequently large stampedes actually occurred during cattle drives. Some early accounts describe terrifying events where entire herds ran for miles before cowboys could regain control. Other researchers believe those stories may have been exaggerated in later retellings. The truth likely falls somewhere in between. Stampedes certainly happened, but experienced crews worked constantly to prevent them. You guide your horse along the herd once more. The animals continue walking, their movements slower now, but still controlled. Riders remain alert. The storm approaches steadily across the horizon, and beneath the darkening sky you realise that guiding a herd through quiet weather is one skill. Keeping them calm when thunder begins to roll across the prairie is something else entirely. The storm finally reaches the prairie with a quiet determination that feels almost patient. The clouds that once hovered along the distant horizon now stretch across the sky above you, thick and layered, turning the bright afternoon into a dim silver light. The wind grows stronger. Grass bends deeply across the plains, whispering in long waves that travel outward from the approaching storm. Dust rises again from the hooves of the cattle, but the wind carries it away quickly now, scattering it across the open land. Your horse lifts its head and snorts softly. The herd senses the change. Cattle begin moving closer together, bunching instinctively as the wind moves through them. Some animals toss their heads, uneasy with the shifting air and the distant thunder that rolls slowly across the sky. You guide your horse along the outer edge of the herd. The riders around you spread themselves carefully, creating a wide living fence made of horses and patience. No one rushes. Sudden movement can make nervous cattle worse. Instead, the cowboys ride slowly steady as the wind. The first drops of rain arrive without warning. They fall lightly at first cool against your hands and face. Dark spots appear in the dust beneath the hooves of the cattle. The smell of rain spreads quickly through the air. Dry grass, warm soil and moisture combine into a scent that feels fresh and almost welcome after the dusty heat of the afternoon. A historically documented reality of cattle drives is that storms could be both helpful and dangerous. Rain cooled the air and refreshed the grass, but thunder and lightning could frighten animals badly enough to trigger chaos within the herd. Right now the rain remains gentle. The cattle continue walking, though more tightly packed than before. You glance toward the trail boss. He rides near the front of the herd, his hat pulled low against the rain. His posture remains calm, but his eyes move constantly across the animals, watching for any sign of panic. Lightning flashes again. This time it streaks clearly across the sky above the plains, a brilliant white line that vanishes almost instantly. Thunder follows more quickly now. Several cattle startle. One steer breaks into a sudden trot, pushing against another animal. The motion ripples through a small cluster of cattle nearby. You guide your horse toward the movement. Your horse responds immediately, stepping quickly into position beside the restless steer. You turn slightly in the saddle, blocking its path with quiet pressure. The steer hesitates. For a moment, its muscles tense as if deciding whether to run. Then it slows. The ripple of motion fades again into the steady movement of the herd. Nearby, another rider speaks softly to the cattle, repeating the same calming phrase over and over. Easy now. Easy. Researchers who study herd animals often observe that cattle react strongly to the behavior of the animals around them. If one runs, others follow. If one relaxes, the calm can spread just as quickly. The riders understand this instinct well. Their job is to prevent that first animal from running. Rain begins falling more steadily now. Small streams of water run through the dust, turning patches of dry ground into dark, damp soil. The cattle continue moving, their coats growing darker as rain soaks into the hair. Your hat protects your face for the moment, though droplets slide from the brim occasionally. The prairie looks different in the rain. Colours deepen, grass darkens, the sky lowers until the horizon seems closer than before. A curious anecdote appears in several trail memoirs, describing how some cowboys believed certain cattle could predict storms. According to these riders, particular animals in the herd sometimes became restless hours before rain arrived, lifting their heads and pacing nervously. Whether that belief came from careful observation or simple superstition remains uncertain, but many cowboys trusted their instincts about livestock behaviour. The thunder continues rolling across the sky. The herd keeps moving. Riders guide their horses along the edges, watching carefully for signs of panic. Despite the storm, a strange calm settles across the prairie. Rain softens the dust. The sound of hooves becomes quieter as the ground absorbs the moisture. Wind moves through the grass with a deeper whisper now. You realise that storms on the plains rarely arrive with dramatic suddenness. Instead, they build slowly, like a conversation growing louder, one sentence at a time. Historians examining cattle drive records sometimes suggest that experienced cowboys developed remarkable patience during these moments. Instead of reacting quickly to every nervous movement, they focused on steady control, trusting that calm behaviour would influence the herd. Watching the riders around you now, you see that patience in action. No one rushes. No one panics. They simply ride. The rain continues falling. Thunder rolls again across the prairie, and beneath the heavy sky, the herd moves forward through the storm with slow, determined steps. Rain continues falling across the prairie, but the storm slowly begins losing its strength. The thunder moves farther away, rolling across the plains in deeper and softer echoes. The sky above remains grey, yet small patches of pale light begin slipping through the clouds. The herd has calmed again. Cattle move steadily through the damp grass, their hooves pressing quietly into soil that has turned darker and softer after the rain. The dust that filled the air earlier has vanished completely, replaced by the earthy scent of wet ground and crushed plants. Your horse walks carefully, adjusting its steps on the slightly slick soil. The animal seems more relaxed now that the thunder has drifted away. You guide it along the side of the herd, watching the cattle closely. Even though the worst of the storm has passed, the riders remain alert. A herd can stay nervous long after thunder fades. Sudden sounds or quick movements can still cause problems. One of the cowboys rides slowly past you, humming a quiet tune. The melody is simple and repetitive, barely louder than the sound of rain dripping from the grass. It floats across the herd in the calm air. Night watches often involved songs like this. Cowboys assigned to guard the herd after dark would ride slow circles around the cattle, singing softly to keep the animals calm. The steady sound reassured the cattle that nothing dangerous was happening nearby. A number of preserved trail journals mention these night songs. Riders describe them as quiet drifting melodies that blended into the darkness of the plains. You imagine what the prairie must sound like at night. Hundreds of cattle breathing softly, hooves shifting occasionally in the grass. a lone voice singing somewhere in the darkness, while a rider circles slowly around the herd. The thought carries a strange sense of calm. The clouds above begin thinning slightly. A faint glow appears where the sun presses against the western horizon behind the remaining storm clouds. The afternoon light returns in muted shades of silver and gold. The herd moves forward once more. Water droplets cling to the coats of the cattle and sparkle faintly in the returning sunlight. The animals seem calmer now, their earlier nervousness fading with the storm. One of the riders ahead of you calls out briefly to another cowboy. Their voices carry easily across the damp air. Communication on the trail often relied on short calls or whistles rather than long conversations. Riders needed to stay aware of the herd, and loud shouting could startle the animals. You guide your horse slightly closer to the herd again. The cattle move in a broad cluster now, their pace slow but steady. A few animals lower their heads occasionally to grab fresh mouthfuls of grass that has been cooled by the rain. Some historical records of cattle drives describe how storms occasionally improved grazing conditions. Rain refreshed the grass and cooled the air, allowing cattle to feed more comfortably during the next stretch of travel. Watching the herd, now you see several steers chewing contentedly as they walk. Your horse flicks water from its mane with a quick shake of the head. Drops scatter through the air before disappearing into the damp grass. A rider near the rear of the herd begins telling a quiet story to the cowboy beside him. The wind carries fragments of the conversation across the prairie. It sounds like a story about a long night ride during a storm several years ago. Cowboys often traded stories like this during slow hours on the trail. Some stories were practical lessons. Others were simply ways to pass the time. A curious detail occasionally mentioned in frontier letters is that some cowboys believed certain songs worked better than others for calming cattle at night. A few riders insisted that slower melodies helped the herd settle more quickly. Whether the cattle truly preferred particular tunes remains uncertain, but the belief was common enough to appear in several accounts. You glance across the wide prairie. The storm clouds continue drifting eastward, slowly revealing more of the bright sky behind them. Sunlight returns in gentle patches across the grasslands. Your horse continues walking patiently. The herd moves forward in a calm rhythm once again. Researchers studying the daily routine of cattle drives often point out that long stretches of uneventful travel were actually the goal. A peaceful herd meant fewer injuries, fewer lost animals, and a safer journey for everyone involved. Excitement on the trail usually meant something had gone wrong. Right now, the prairie feels quiet again. Rainwater glistens on the grass. The wind softens. The sky slowly brightens as the storm fades into the distance. And as you ride beside the herd through the damp golden light of late afternoon, the steady rhythm of the cattle drive returns once more. The prairie feels washed and quiet after the storm. Rain has settled the dust and darkened the soil, leaving the land smelling rich and alive. The herd continues forward in a broad, drifting mass, their hooves pressing softly into the damp ground. Each step produces a dull thud rather than the dry rustling sound from earlier in the day. Your horse seems grateful for the cooler air. The animal walks with relaxed confidence, now its ears shifting occasionally toward the sounds of cattle and distant riders. Water droplets still cling to the mane and saddle leather, catching the fading sunlight as the afternoon slowly begins leaning toward evening. The storm clouds continue sliding away across the horizon. Behind them, the sky brightens again, revealing wide layers of pale gold light spreading across the plains. Riding beside the herd in this calmer moment, your thoughts begin drifting toward the men who share the trail with you. At first glance, cowboys can appear remarkably similar. Wide hats, dusty coats, sun-darkened skin, quiet expressions. But the longer you ride together, the more differences begin to appear. One rider laughs easily, and often his voice carrying across the herd whenever something mildly amusing happens. Another speaks rarely, communicating mostly through nods and short phrases. A man near the rear of the herd whistles constantly, producing the same simple tune every few minutes as if the prairie itself requires background music. The crew becomes familiar in the slow way that people grow comfortable around one another during long journeys. A widely accepted piece of historical research shows that cattle drive crews were often smaller than modern audiences imagine. Many drives were managed by only 10 to 15 riders responsible for guiding thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles of open land. It meant that every rider mattered. Each cowboy held a specific position around the herd, and the absence of even one person could make the work more difficult for everyone else. You watch as one of the riders adjusts his saddle strap while riding. The movement is smooth and practiced, done without stopping his horse. Cowboys spent so many hours in the saddle that even small adjustments became second nature. The prairie continues rolling endlessly ahead. Grass sways gently beneath the returning sunlight. A few birds appear in the distance, now that the storm has passed, gliding low across the land in quiet search of insects stirred up by the rain. You hear the sound of laughter drifting from a pair of riders farther ahead. The conversation seems light, perhaps about the storm that just passed. Storytelling forms a natural part of life on the trail. During long hours of riding, cowboys often traded stories about earlier drives, difficult cattle, or strange encounters on the frontier. Some stories carried practical lessons, others served purely as entertainment. Many historians who examine cowboy folklore note that storytelling became an important cultural tradition among trail crews. These stories helped pass time and also preserved shared experiences from one generation of riders to the next. Listening to the quiet laughter ahead, you suspect the current story has grown more dramatic than the original event. That seems to be the natural direction of trail stories. A small group of cattle begins drifting slightly toward the edge of the herd again. You guide your horse gently in their direction. Your horse steps forward without hesitation, placing itself calmly between the wandering steers and the open prairie beyond. The cattle hesitate briefly before turning back toward the larger group. Your horse seems almost proud of the correction. Working cattle horses developed reputations of their own among cowboys. Certain animals became known for their quick reactions and sharp instincts around livestock. A curious observation from several ranch records mentions that some horses developed favourite riders, responding more eagerly to familiar voices or commands. Whether this preference came from training or simple personality is difficult to determine, but many cowboys believe strongly in the bond between rider and horse. The herd continues forward at the same gentle pace. Hooves press into damp soil. Grass bends beneath heavy bodies. The sky grows brighter as the last clouds of the storm fade into the distance. You glance again toward the trail boss riding ahead. His posture remains relaxed but attentive. Leading a drive required constant judgment about direction, grazing opportunities, water sources, and potential dangers. Some historians continue discussing just how much authority trail bosses held over their crews. While they made most of the important decisions, the success of a drive depended heavily on cooperation among all riders. Out here, survival often required teamwork more than strict hierarchy. You watch as the riders maintain their positions around the herd. Each person understands their role. Each horse moves with practiced patience. The prairie stretches endlessly around the slow-moving animals. And as the evening light begins touching the grasslands with deeper shades of gold, the long day on the trail drifts quietly toward its final hours. The sun begins lowering towards the western edge of the prairie, and the light across the grasslands changes once again. Afternoon brightness softens into a warm golden glow that stretches long shadows behind the cattle as they move. The herd continues forward, though the pace grows slower with each passing mile. After a full day of walking, even the most patient animals begin showing signs of fatigue. Heads hang lower, steps become heavier. You feel the change in your own body as well. Your back carries a steady ache from hours in the saddle. Your legs feel slightly stiff whenever your horse shifts direction, yet the slow rhythm of the trail continues and your body gradually accepts it as part of the day. The prairie spreads around you in enormous quiet. No towns appear on the horizon. No fences break the open grasslands. Only distant hills and scattered patches of brush interrupt the endless sweep of land. Moments like this remind you how isolated the frontier could feel. Many people imagine the Wild West as crowded with saloons, outlaws and dramatic encounters. In reality, cowboys often spent weeks travelling through empty landscapes, where the only regular company came from fellow riders and the herd itself. A widely recognised historical observation explains that cattle drives frequently crossed hundreds of miles of sparsely populated land. Between ranches and railheads, the prairie could feel almost completely empty. The sense of distance begins settling into your thoughts. You watch the herd moving slowly ahead, their shapes stretching long across the grass beneath the lowering sun. Dust no longer rises as it did earlier. The damp soil from the storm keeps the ground firm and quiet. Your horse continues walking patiently beneath you. A light breeze moves through the tall grass again, carrying the faint scent of evening. The air cools, slightly easing the heat that lingered during the afternoon. Riding beside the herd, your mind begins drifting in the quiet. Life on the trail offers long stretches of silence, and cowboys often spent those hours thinking about home, family, or whatever might wait at the end of the drive. For some riders, the trail provided freedom. For others, it brought loneliness. Scholars who study frontier life often discuss how isolation shaped the emotional experiences of cowboys. Spending weeks away from towns and familiar surroundings could feel peaceful at times, but it also created a sense of separation from the rest of the world. You glance toward the other riders. Most of them appear calm, focused on the herd or the land ahead. Conversation fades during these late afternoon hours as fatigue settles gently over the crew. One cowboy rides with his hat pulled low, humming quietly under his breath. Another studies the sky, perhaps judging how much daylight remains before the herd must stop for the night. Your horse flicks its ears toward the herd. Cattle produce a steady background sound as they move. Low breathing, occasional calls, hooves brushing through grass. The sounds form a constant quiet presence that becomes almost comforting. A curious detail appears in several trail letters written by cowboys during the late 19th century. Some riders admitted that after spending weeks on the open plains, they sometimes felt uneasy when returning to crowded towns. The silence of the prairie could become strangely familiar. You imagine arriving in a busy cattle town after weeks of riding through quiet grasslands. The noise of people, wagons, and music might feel overwhelming at first. For now, though, the prairie remains peaceful. The trail boss signals gently to the riders. It is nearly time to stop. Cattle drives usually ended the day before darkness fully arrived. Gathering the herd into a safe position allowed riders to keep watch through the night and prevent animals from wandering away. You guide your horse closer to the herd again. The cattle bunch together gradually as riders move into position. Horses circle slowly, encouraging the animals to form a loose cluster across a patch of grass suitable for grazing during the night. The sky continues shifting colours. Gold deepens into amber. Amber slowly fades into the cooler shades of early evening. Researchers studying cattle drive routines have noted that night watch duties rotated among the cowboys. Each rider took turns guarding the herd during different hours of the night, while others rested. It meant that sleep came in short segments rather than long, comfortable nights. You glance across the herd as the cattle begin settling into their evening positions. Some animals lie down in the grass, others remain standing, chewing slowly, while the last light of day spreads across the plains. The chuck wagon appears in the distance, once more rolling slowly toward the camp location chosen by the trail boss. Soon there will be supper. Soon the riders will gather near the fire. But for now, beneath the fading light of evening, you remain in the saddle beside the herd, watching the endless prairie grow quiet once again. The prairie settles into evening with the kind of quiet that feels almost deliberate. The sun sinks slowly toward the horizon, spreading long amber light across the grasslands. Shadows stretch behind every animal in the herd, turning the landscape into a pattern of dark shapes and soft golden glow. The cattle gradually come to rest. Some lie down in the grass, folding their legs carefully beneath their heavy bodies. Others remain standing, chewing slowly and watching the riders circle around them. The herd spreads across a wide patch of prairie chosen by the trail boss for its good grazing and open visibility. Your horse slows to an easy stop. You swing down from the saddle, landing on ground that still carries a little warmth from the afternoon sun. After hours of riding, your legs feel slightly stiff, but the feeling fades as you take a few slow steps through the grass. Nearby, the chuck wagon has already arrived. The cook moves around the wagon with the same steady confidence you have come to expect. A small fire crackles beside the wagon, sending thin threads of smoke into the evening air. The smell of wood smoke mixes with the scent of damp grass and cattle. Even before the food is ready, the fire itself feels comforting. You loosen the cinch on your horse's saddle so the animal can relax. The horse lowers its head and begins nibbling at the grass, grateful for the chance to rest after the long day. Cowboys depended on their horses more than almost anything else on the trail. Without strong, reliable horses guiding a herd across hundreds of miles of open country would have been nearly impossible. Riders spent many hours caring for their animals because a tired or injured horse could place both rider and herd at risk. A number of ranch records from the late 19th century describe how cowboys sometimes rotated between several horses during long drives. This allowed each horse to rest while another carried the rider during the day. Your horse lifts its head briefly and flicks its ears toward you. You pat the animal gently along the neck. The connection between rider and horse grows naturally after many days on the trail. Each learns the habits and movements of the other. Nearby, several riders begin unsaddling their horses as well. Saddles are lifted carefully to allow the animals to cool down before the night air settles over the prairie. The herd remains calm. Cattle chew slowly, their steady breathing blending into the quiet sounds of evening. A few animals shift positions in the grass, settling themselves more comfortably as darkness approaches. You walk toward the chuck wagon. The cook has already begun preparing supper. A pot hangs over the fire, sending up a rich smell that immediately attracts the attention of several hungry cowboys. Meals on the trail were rarely complicated, but after a full day of work, even simple food feels deeply satisfying. A well-established historical detail is that trail crews often ate beans biscuits, salt pork and coffee as their regular diet. These foods travelled well in wagons and could be prepared quickly over open fires. Occasionally the cook might add dried fruit or fresh game if someone managed to hunt along the trail. Tonight the smell suggests beans again. No one seems disappointed. Cowboys gather near the wagon, accepting tin plates as the cook serves each portion. You take a plate and sit near the fire, letting the warmth soak into your tired muscles. The sky above begins shifting toward deeper shades of blue. The last light of sunset lingers along the horizon, turning the clouds faint shades of orange and purple. Stars will appear soon once the darkness settles fully over the prairie. One of the cowboys begins telling a story while everyone eats. His voice carries easily through the calm air. The story involves a horse that apparently refused to cross a shallow stream during a previous drive. According to the storyteller, the animal stood stubbornly in place for nearly an hour, while the rider attempted every possible trick to persuade it forward. The other cowboys laugh quietly. Stories about stubborn horses appear frequently in frontier accounts. Horses, like people, develop personalities of their own, and those personalities sometimes created unexpected moments of frustration or humour. Whether this particular story happened exactly as described remains uncertain, but the laughter suggests that every cowboy in the group has experienced something similar. The fire crackles gently. Sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. Scholars who study frontier culture often note that campfires served as important social spaces on cattle drives. After long silent hours riding beside the herd, these moments around the fire allowed cowboys to share stories, relax and reconnect with one another. You finish your meal slowly. The food tastes simple but satisfying. Across the prairie, the herd remains calm beneath the fading light. Soon, the riders will begin organising the night watch, assigning shifts to circle the cattle while others sleep. But for a few quiet minutes more, you sit beside the fire with the other cowboys watching the last colours of sunset fade across the endless plains. Evening deepens slowly across the prairie. The last glow of sunset fades from the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of blue that gradually darkens toward night. One by one, the first stars appear overhead, bright and steady in the clear air that follows the storm. The herd rests quietly across the grass. Most of the cattle lie down now, their large shapes scattered across the prairie like dark stones in a field. Others remain standing, chewing slowly and shifting their weight now and then. Their breathing creates a low, steady sound that carries softly across the camp. The chuck wagon fire burns steadily. Its warm light flickers across the faces of the cowboys gathered nearby. Plates are empty now, and the cook has begun rinsing a few utensils with practiced care. You lean back slightly, letting the warmth of the fire ease the stiffness in your shoulders. The long day in the saddle has left its mark. Your legs feel heavy and your back carries a dull ache that reminds you how many miles the herd travelled today. Yet the calm of the evening softens the discomfort. Out here, the night sky feels enormous. Without city lights or buildings, the stars appear brighter than most people ever see in their daily lives. Entire bands of faint starlight stretch across the sky like silver dust scattered over dark velvet. Several cowboys glance upward occasionally, following familiar constellations. Before modern navigation tools became common, many riders learned to recognize the stars as guides across the open range. On clear nights, the position of certain constellations helped determine direction during long rides. Historical records from ranch operations suggest that many trail bosses valued riders who could navigate confidently after dark. Being able to recognize the North Star or track the movement of the moon sometimes proved useful during unexpected night travel. One of the cowboys near the fire begins quietly tuning a small harmonica. The instrument produces a few soft notes that drift gently into the night air. The sound blends with the steady breathing of the herd and the faint rustle of grass moving in the evening breeze. Music occasionally appeared on the trail in small moments like this. A few cowboys carried simple instruments such as harmonicas or fiddles, while large gatherings with music were rare during long drives. Quiet songs sometimes helped pass time during calm evenings. The harmonica player begins a slow melody. It's not loud or dramatic, just a simple tune that rises and falls like the motion of the prairie wind. The herd remains relaxed. Cattle rarely react strongly to quiet music, and the steady sound seems to blend into the peaceful atmosphere of the camp. You watch the flickering firelight dance across the ground. Sparks rise briefly before disappearing into the dark sky. The prairie stretches silent beyond the small circle of firelight. A curious observation appears in several letters written by ranch workers during the late 19th century. Some cowboys mention that after spending long periods on the open plains, they developed an unusually strong awareness of small nighttime sounds. The movement of a single animal, the distant call of a bird, even the soft rustle of grass could draw attention quickly. This heightened awareness helped riders detect trouble before it spread through the herd. The harmonica melody fades gradually. One by one, the cowboys begin standing from their places near the fire. Night watch duties must be organised. Protecting the herd through the night was essential. Even calm cattle might wander if left unattended, and unexpected noises could still startle them in the darkness. The trail boss speaks quietly, assigning shifts to the riders. Each cowboy will take a turn riding slow circles around the herd while the others rest. These watches usually last a few hours before another rider replaces the guard. Sleep on the trail rarely comes in long stretches. Researchers who examine the daily routines of cattle drives often point out that night watch duty required patience more than excitement. Most nights pass quietly, with the rider guiding a horse around the sleeping herd while listening to the sounds of the prairie. Occasionally a rider might sing softly to keep the cattle calm. Tonight the first watch begins soon. You rise from the ground and stretch your arms slowly. The stars shine brightly overhead, now forming patterns that seem almost close enough to touch. Across the prairie, the herd remains peaceful. The fire crackles gently beside the chuck wagon. The riders prepare for another long, quiet part of the day that takes place entirely under the open sky. And as darkness settles fully across the plains, the cattle drive continues in its own slow rhythm through the night. Night settles fully across the prairie, and the world becomes quieter than it has been all day. The last glow of evening disappears from the horizon, leaving only the wide sky filled with bright, steady stars. The herd lies scattered across the grass. Hundreds of dark shapes rest under the open sky, some sleeping, others chewing slowly in the calm night air. Their breathing forms a low, steady rhythm that drifts across the prairie like a gentle tide. You prepare for your turn on night watch. One of the earlier riders finishes his shift and guides his horse back toward the campfire. The small fire near the chuck wagon glows softly now, sending up a thin column of sparks that vanish quickly into the darkness. He nods to you as you mount your horse. The exchange requires no words. You guide your horse slowly away from the firelight and toward the resting herd. Night riding feels very different from travelling during the day. Without the sun, the prairie becomes a landscape of shadow and quiet shapes. The stars provide enough light to reveal the outline of the herd and the distant horizon, but everything appears softer and less certain. Your horse walks carefully through the grass. The animal seems to understand the slower pace required during night watch. Each step is measured and quiet. Night guard duties were a routine part of nearly every cattle drive. Riders took turns circling the herd throughout the night, making sure the animals remained calm and together. Historical documents from ranch records show that these watches often lasted 2 to 3 hours before another cowboy took over the task. The work could feel peaceful or exhausting depending on the night. You begin guiding your horse in a wide, slow circle around the outer edge of the herd. The cattle barely react to your presence. A few animals lift their heads briefly, then settle again when they recognize the familiar rhythm of a rider moving nearby. The prairie is filled with subtle sounds now. Grass brushing against hooves, the occasional soft snort from a resting steer, the quiet movement of your horse breathing in the cool night air. Far away, a nightbird calls once before falling silent again. You begin humming quietly. Many riders develop this habit during night watch. The steady sound reassures the cattle, and also keeps the rider awake during long quiet hours under the stars. Some researchers studying cowboy life have suggested that night watch may have been one of the most reflective times during a cattle drive. With the herd calm and the world silent, riders often found themselves alone with their thoughts. You guide your horse past the far side of the herd. A few cattle shift positions in the grass, their large shapes rising slowly before settling again. The stars above seem brighter than ever. Without lanterns or buildings to block the sky, the entire prairie feels wrapped in starlight. Constellations stretch across the heavens in patterns that many riders learn to recognize over time. Your horse pauses briefly to graze at a patch of grass before you guide it onward again. A curious detail recorded in several trail journals describes how some cowboys spoke quietly to their horses during night watch. Riders sometimes treated their horses almost like companions, sharing thoughts aloud simply to hear a human voice in the vast silence. Whether the horses understood any of it remains a mystery, but the habit appears often in personal accounts of life on the trail. You continue circling the herd. The movement becomes steady and familiar. Step by step, your horse follows the same wide path around the resting cattle. Each loop takes several minutes, giving you time to watch the herd carefully. Most of the animals remain calm. One steer stands, briefly stretches its neck, then lowers itself back into the grass. The prairie wind moves gently now, carrying the cool scent of damp earth left behind by the earlier storm. Historians examining cattle drive life sometimes discuss how demanding these night watches could be after a full day in the saddle. Riders often had only a few hours of rest before their turn began, yet they still needed to remain alert in case the herd became restless. You feel the weight of the long day in your muscles, yet the quiet beauty of the night makes the task feel almost peaceful. The fire near the chuck wagon glows faintly in the distance. Beyond that small light, the prairie stretches endlessly beneath the stars. You guide your horse through another slow circle around the herd. The cattle breathe steadily, the grass rustles softly, and beneath the vast, silent sky of the frontier, the night watch continues. The night deepens as you continue riding your slow circles around the herd. The stars seem brighter now that your eyes have adjusted to the darkness, and the prairie stretches in every direction like a quiet ocean of grass. Your horse walks patiently beneath you. The animal's breathing is steady, and its hooves move through the grass with soft, careful steps. Each time you complete a full circle around the herd, you begin another one following nearly the same path through the darkness. The cattle remain calm. Most of them lie quietly in the grass, their bodies forming scattered shapes across the prairie. A few animals stand and shift position from time to time, but none appear alarmed. You hum softly again, letting the quiet melody drift across the herd. Night songs often had no clear beginning or end. Riders repeated simple phrases or melodies over and over again, creating a gentle rhythm that blended with the sounds of the sleeping cattle. A number of ranch memoirs from the late 19th century mention these songs as part of everyday life on the trail. They were not formal performances, just quiet habits that helped riders stay alert during long night watches. The prairie air feels cooler now. The warmth from the afternoon has faded completely, replaced by a crisp night breeze that brushes gently across the grass. You pull your coat slightly closer around your shoulders. Far in the distance, you hear the faint call of a coyote. The sound rises briefly, then fades into the night. Your horse lifts its head at the noise, but quickly settles again. Wildlife often moved through the prairie after dark, though most animals avoided the presence of large cattle herds and human riders. You guide your horse past the far side of the herd once more. A few cattle stir as you pass, lifting their heads before settling back down again. The steady movement of the rider seems to reassure them that everything remains normal. Night watch required patience more than action. Archival ranch records indicate that most nights passed without any serious disturbances. Riders simply circled the herd, listening carefully for unusual sounds or signs of nervous movement among the cattle. Yet the possibility of sudden trouble always existed. A loud noise, a flash of lightning, or even a startled animal could send the entire herd running into the darkness. That knowledge keeps your attention sharp. You glance toward the horizon. The prairie looks different at night. Landmarks that appeared clear during the daylight now dissolve into shadow. Only the outlines of low hills and distant trees remain visible against the starlit sky. Your horse continues walking slowly. The saddle creaks softly beneath you with each step. After the long day of riding, the sound feels strangely comforting. A curious story appears in one surviving cowboy diary describing how a rider once fell asleep in the saddle during night watch. According to the account, his horse continued walking the same circle around the herd out of habit until another cowboy noticed and gently woke him. Whether the story was meant as humour or warning is difficult to know, but it suggests that experienced horses sometimes understood their roles as well as the riders. You smile slightly at the thought. Your horse flicks an ear backward as if aware of your reaction. The herd remains peaceful. Several cattle lie close together now, their large shapes rising and falling slowly as they breathe. Others stand quietly, their silhouettes dark against the pale grass. Your humming fades into silence for a moment. The prairie feels immense under the night sky. Scholars who study the psychology of frontier life sometimes discuss how extended periods in wide open landscapes affected people emotionally. For many cowboys, the constant exposure to vast empty spaces produced a mixture of calm reflection and quiet loneliness. Riding beneath the stars, now you understand how both feelings could exist at the same time. The silence feels peaceful, yet it also reminds you how far the nearest town might be. You complete another slow circle around the herd. In the distance, the faint glow of the chuck wagon fire still marks the centre of camp. One of the resting cowboys turns in his bedroll, shifting slightly before settling again. Soon your shift will end. Another rider will take your place, continuing the slow watch through the remaining hours of darkness. For now, though, the night remains calm. The cattle breathe quietly. The prairie wind moves gently through the grass, and you continue guiding your horse around the sleeping herd beneath the endless stars of the frontier sky. Eventually, your shift on night watch comes to an end. Another cowboy rides slowly toward you from the direction of the campfire, his horse moving with the same patient rhythm you have followed for the past hours. The exchange happens quietly. A nod, a few brief words, and the circle of responsibility passes from one rider to another. You guide your horse back toward camp. The fire near the chuck wagon has burned low now, glowing mostly as red coals with an occasional small flame flickering above the wood. The cook sleeps somewhere nearby, wrapped in a blanket beside the wagon. Most of the other riders lie in their bedroll shapes, barely visible in the dim light. You dismount slowly. Your legs feel stiff again after the long hours in the saddle, though the feeling fades after a few steps across the grass. Your horse lowers its head and begins grazing quietly beside the camp. You remove the saddle and rest it against the wagon wheel. Many cowboys preferred to let their horses graze freely overnight rather than tying them tightly, allowing the animals to rest and recover after the long day. You roll out your bedroll near the dying fire. The ground still carries a faint warmth from the earlier flames. Above you, the sky remains filled with stars stretching endlessly from one horizon to the other. Sleep arrives quickly on the trail. After a day of riding and a shift on night watch, your body accepts rest without hesitation. You close your eyes. The sounds of the prairie drift around you. Cattle breathing softly in the distance. Grass whispering in the night breeze. The occasional quiet movement of the cowboy riding the next watch. Somewhere far away, a coyote calls once more before the prairie returns to silence. Eventually, morning begins its slow return. The sky lightens gradually from black to deep blue. A faint grey line appears along the eastern horizon, spreading upward through the darkness. You open your eyes to the cool air of dawn. The camp stirs once again. The cook is already awake, moving around the chuck wagon as he prepares the first pot of coffee for the day. The smell drifts across the prairie, rich and strong enough to wake even the most exhausted rider. A commonly accepted historical detail about cowboy life is that coffee served as a nearly constant companion on cattle drives. Riders drank it early in the morning during midday breaks, and often again late at night during watch shifts. It was simple, strong and easy to prepare over a campfire. You sit up slowly and stretch your arms. The prairie looks different in the pale light of early morning. Dew glistens on the grass, reflecting the first hints of sunlight. The herd remains calm, though a few cattle have already begun standing and grazing. Nearby, another cowboy rolls out of his bedroll and rubs sleep from his eyes. The routine of the trail begins again. Breakfast will come first. Then the herd will gather and move forward across the plains, just as it did yesterday. The repetition might seem dull to someone imagining the adventure of the Wild West. Yet for the riders guiding cattle across these vast distances, routine created stability. Predictable days kept the herd calm and the crew organised. One of the cowboys walks toward the wagon and accepts a tin cup of coffee from the cook. He takes a careful sip and nods with approval. A curious little habit, recorded in several cowboy letters, involved riders adding a pinch of salt to their coffee during particularly long drives. Some believed it softened the bitterness of the brew. Whether that method actually improved the flavour remains open to debate. You stand and walk toward the wagon yourself. The cook pours coffee into your tin cup without ceremony. Steam curls upward into the cool morning air. As you drink, you glance toward the herd once more. Several cattle stand now, stretching their necks and shifting their weight in the grass. Soon the entire herd will begin stirring again. Historians examining life on cattle drives sometimes discuss how repetitive the routine could become after several weeks. Each day followed a similar pattern of early rising, long riding hours and quiet nights under the open sky. Yet that steady rhythm helped thousands of cattle travel safely across enormous distances. You finish your coffee slowly. The prairie brightens as the sun approaches the horizon once more. Another day on the trail is about to begin, and the herd, calm and patient in the morning light, waits quietly for the riders to guide them forward again across the endless grasslands. Morning spreads gently across the prairie once again. The sun lifts above the horizon in slow silence, casting pale gold light across the grasslands and waking the world piece by piece. The camp begins moving almost immediately. Cowboys roll their bedrolls, shake dust from their coats, and walk toward the chuck wagon where the cook continues pouring coffee into waiting tin cups. The smell drifts through the cool air, strong and familiar. You take another cup and stand quietly for a moment watching the herd. Many of the cattle are already awake. Some stretch their necks toward the fresh grass, while others shuffle slowly into standing positions. Their movements create soft rippling sounds across the prairie. The day's work will begin soon. Before that happens, the crew gathers briefly near the wagon to eat. Breakfast on the trail usually looks very similar from one day to the next. Today the cook serves beans, biscuits, and a small portion of salt pork. The meal is simple but filling, and no one complains. After hours of riding the previous day, even plain food tastes satisfying. A frequently mentioned detail in ranch records shows that cowboy wages during the 1880s were modest compared to many other frontier occupations. Many trail riders earned somewhere between $25 and $40 per month, depending on experience and the length of the drive. The work demanded long hours and physical endurance, yet it rarely made anyone wealthy. For many young men, however, the trail offered something just as valuable: opportunity. You sit on a wooden crate near the wagon and finish the last bite of biscuit. The morning air still feels cool, though the sun promises another warm afternoon ahead. Nearby, one of the cowboys laughs quietly at a joke shared with the cook. Conversation drifts across the camp. A rider mentions the town they may reach in several days once the herd approaches the railhead. Another cowboy wonders aloud whether the local saloon still serves decent whiskey. The thought of town brings a small spark of excitement. Life on the trail remains peaceful in many ways, but weeks of riding across empty grasslands can leave cowboys eager for the noise and movement of civilization. You finish your coffee and set the cup back on the wagon. Horses wait nearby, saddled and ready. The herd continues stirring. Several cattle begin walking slowly through the grass, drifting toward the main group as riders guide them gently into position. The quiet organisation of the morning begins once again. A curious detail preserved in several frontier memoirs suggests that some cowboys spent their wages almost immediately once they reached town. After weeks of hard work and isolation, the sudden availability of saloons, gambling tables and stores often proved too tempting to resist. Some riders returned to the trail nearly broke. Others managed to save a portion of their earnings, sending money home or keeping it for future plans. The prairie brightens steadily as the sun climbs higher. You walk towards your horse and check the saddle straps carefully before mounting again. The leather feels familiar beneath your hands, now worn smooth from years of use. Your horse seems ready for the day. The animal shifts its weight and flicks its ears forward, watching the movement of cattle across the grass. Cowboys depended on reliable horses for nearly every aspect of their work. Ranch records from the period show that experienced riders often developed strong preferences for certain horses, trusting animals that responded quickly to cattle movement. You swing into the saddle. Around you, the other riders mount their horses as well. The trail boss rides toward the front of the herd, glancing across the cattle to make sure they remain gathered properly. Once everyone reaches their positions along the sides and rear, the slow process of guiding the herd begins again. Historians continue discussing whether cowboy life offered true freedom or simply another form of demanding labour. Some accounts describe the open range as a place of independence and adventure. Others emphasize the hard work, low pay, and long months away from family. Looking around the prairie, now both interpretations seem possible. The land stretches endlessly ahead. The herd moves slowly. The riders guide them forward with quiet patience. Another day of the long journey begins. The cattle drift across the sunlit grasslands, and you settle into the saddle once more, ready to follow the same steady rhythm that has carried the herd across the plains day after day. The herd begins moving again with the same slow patience that defines life on the trail. Morning sunlight spreads wider across the prairie, now warming the damp grass left behind by the previous evening's rain. Hooves press softly into the soil as the cattle drift forward in a broad, uneven line. You ride along the edge of the herd, letting your horse settle into its familiar walking rhythm. The saddle creaks quietly beneath you. The sound is almost comforting now, a steady companion that marks the passing hours. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead. Grass ripples in the breeze like water moving across a shallow lake. Occasionally, a cluster of wildflowers appears in bright patches of colour before disappearing behind the slow-moving herd. The world feels wide and quiet. As you ride, your thoughts drift towards something that does not appear very often on cattle drives: families. The life of a cowboy keeps riders away from towns and settlements for long stretches of time. Weeks or even months can pass between visits to places where ordinary domestic life continues. A well-documented historical observation is that many cowboys were unmarried young men, often in their late teens or 20s. The constant travel of cattle drives made it difficult to maintain stable family lives. Some riders eventually settled down after leaving the trail. Others spent many years moving from ranch to ranch, following seasonal work wherever cattle needed guiding. You glance toward the other riders. Most of them carry the quiet expressions of people accustomed to long journeys and simple routines. Conversation rises occasionally, but much of the day passes in silence. One cowboy rides with a small photograph tucked inside the band of his hat. You notice him remove it briefly during a quiet moment. The image is small and slightly faded. Perhaps a sister, perhaps a sweetheart waiting somewhere far away from the open plains. He studies the picture for only a moment before slipping it back into place. Little reminders of home often travelled with cowboys on long drives. Letters folded into coat pockets, small photographs, occasionally even a keepsake object carried from town to town. These items served as quiet connections to the lives waiting beyond the prairie. Some researchers studying frontier culture have pointed out that the emotional lives of cowboys remain difficult to understand fully. Many riders left few written records of their personal thoughts, leaving historians to interpret their experiences through scattered diaries and letters. Yet small clues appear in those documents. Moments of loneliness, memories of family, dreams about future plans beyond the trail. You guide your horse closer to the herd as a few cattle begin drifting toward a patch of thicker grass. Your horse responds instantly, stepping into their path with calm confidence. The cattle hesitate briefly before turning back toward the main group. The movement feels almost effortless now. Days of riding beside the herd have sharpened your awareness of cattle behaviour. The prairie wind carries the faint scent of warm earth again as the sun climbs higher. Flies return as well, circling lazily around the herd and occasionally drifting toward the riders. Horses flick their tails in irritation while cattle shake their heads. The herd continues its slow march across the grasslands. You hear a short laugh from one of the riders behind you. He has begun telling a story about a small ranch town he once visited several years earlier. According to his account, the town had only one street, 2 stores, and a saloon that served whiskey strong enough to wake a sleeping mule. The other riders listen with quiet amusement. Stories about towns often grow exaggerated during long cattle drives. A curious detail appears in a few surviving cowboy letters describing how some riders became surprisingly nervous when returning to populated towns after weeks on the trail. The sudden crowds, noise and activity felt overwhelming compared to the calm routine of the open range. Silence, it seems, can become a habit. You glance again toward the horizon. No buildings appear yet, only endless prairie stretching outward beneath the bright sky. Scholars continue discussing how the myth of the rugged, independent cowboy grew so powerful in American culture. While the image of the lone rider remains popular, the reality of cattle drives depended heavily on cooperation between many riders working together. The herd moves forward. Each cowboy watches a different section of animals. Each horse responds to subtle signals from its rider. Together, they guide thousands of cattle across land that seems almost too vast to cross. The sun rises higher above the plains. Dust begins lifting once more from the hooves of the herd. Another long stretch of riding unfolds across the prairie. And as the cattle continue drifting northward, the quiet rhythm of the trail carries you deeper into the wide open heart of the frontier. The herd keeps its slow, patient course across the prairie as the morning grows warmer. Sunlight spreads across the grasslands in wide, pale bands, illuminating the long line of cattle drifting steadily through the land. Hooves brush through tall grass, producing a soft, rustling sound that rises and falls like distant wind through leaves. You ride along the outer edge of the herd once again. By now, the work feels familiar. Your eyes move constantly across the cattle, noticing small shifts in movement, watching for animals that wander too far from the group. Your horse responds quickly whenever you guide it toward a drifting steer. The partnership between rider and horse grows stronger with each passing day. As the herd moves forward, you begin noticing something else about the men riding beside you. They are not all the same. At first glance, cowboys often appear similar. Dusty clothes, worn hats, leather boots, sun-weathered faces. Yet the longer you spend on the trail, the more you realize that the group represents many different backgrounds. One rider speaks with a strong Spanish accent when he talks. Another occasionally hums a tune that sounds like a song from the American South. A third carries himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has worked cattle for many years. Historical research into the cattle industry reveals that the cowboy workforce was remarkably diverse during the 19th century. Mexican vaqueros had been herding cattle across the Southwest long before large American cattle drives began, and many of their riding techniques strongly influenced later cowboy traditions. African American cowboys also played a significant role on the frontier. Following the Civil War, many black men found work as cowboys, where skill with horses and cattle mattered more than social background. Some historians estimate that roughly 1 out of every 4 cowboys during this era may have been African American. The trail crew riding beside you likely reflects this mixture of cultures and experiences. Each rider brings different knowledge to the work. You guide your horse around a cluster of cattle that have slowed to graze on a patch of thick grass. Your horse steps carefully, positioning itself where the cattle will turn back toward the herd rather than wandering away. The animals respond calmly, continuing their slow walk forward. The prairie breeze carries faint warmth now. The sun climbs higher overhead, brightening the sky until it becomes a wide, endless blue. Dust begins lifting again from the hooves of the herd as the ground dries beneath the morning light. One of the riders begins telling a story as he rides. The tale involves a previous drive where a steer apparently developed the habit of following one particular horse wherever it went. According to the story, the animal refused to stay with the herd and instead walked directly behind the horse for nearly an entire day. The riders nearby laugh quietly. Whether the event happened exactly as described remains uncertain, but the image of a stubborn steer following a horse across the prairie is amusing enough to pass the time. A curious note appears in several cattle drive accounts, describing how individual animals occasionally became strangely memorable to the riders. Certain steers developed reputations for unusual behavior, and cowboys sometimes recognized these animals weeks later during long drives. It suggests that even within massive herds, particular personalities occasionally stood out. The herd continues forward. You adjust your position slightly as the trail boss signals for riders to spread out along the sides again. Keeping the cattle loosely gathered requires constant attention. No single rider controls the herd alone. The entire crew works together to guide the animals across the plains. Researchers who examine ranch operations often emphasize that cattle drives relied heavily on teamwork. While the trail boss held authority over decisions, every rider played an essential role in maintaining the stability of the herd. Watching the riders around you now, the cooperation becomes clear. Each cowboy responds quickly to movement within the herd. Each horse shifts direction with quiet precision. The prairie stretches endlessly around the slow-moving animals. Some scholars continue discussing how the myth of the solitary cowboy overshadowed the collective nature of cattle driving. Popular stories often focus on lone heroes, yet real cattle drives required careful coordination among many riders working side by side. Out here, survival and success depend on shared effort. You glance once more across the herd. Hundreds of cattle drift steadily through the tall grass. The riders maintain their wide circle of guidance. The prairie wind moves gently beneath the bright sun, and the long trail north continues unfolding mile by mile across the endless frontier. The morning gradually shifts toward midday once again. The sun climbs higher, and the light across the prairie grows brighter and more direct. Grass that still carried dew earlier now dries beneath the warmth. Dust begins rising once more from the hooves of the cattle as the herd moves forward in its steady, slow rhythm. You guide your horse along the outer edge of the herd, watching carefully. By now the routine feels almost natural. Your eyes move constantly from one part of the herd to another, noticing small changes in movement before they become problems. A steer slows unexpectedly. Another drifts toward the side. Your horse responds as soon as you guide it forward, stepping smoothly into position and nudging the wandering animals back toward the center of the herd. The work rarely stops, yet it also rarely becomes dramatic. Most of cowboy life consists of quiet attention. The prairie stretches wide and empty around you. A few scattered birds circle overhead, gliding through the warm air as they search the grass for insects stirred by the moving cattle. The wind carries the familiar mixture of smells: warm soil, dry grass, cattle and leather. You shift slightly in the saddle. The soreness in your muscles returns again as the day continues. Riding for long hours may look peaceful from a distance, but your body feels every mile. Historical records from ranch operations frequently mention how physically demanding cattle drives could be. Riders spent day after day in the saddle, often under intense sun, rain or wind. Minor injuries such as sore joints, blisters and strained muscles were common. Despite the hardships, cowboys usually continued riding unless something serious occurred. The herd moved slowly across a shallow rise in the land. From the top of the hill, you can see the cattle stretching out below their dark shapes, scattered across the prairie like a moving patchwork. You pause for a moment, watching the landscape unfold. There are no fences, no roads, only grasslands rolling toward the distant horizon. Life on the frontier carried its own quiet risks. Accidents could happen easily during cattle drives. A horse might stumble on uneven ground. A rider could be thrown from the saddle. A startled animal might charge unexpectedly. Medical help rarely existed nearby. Researchers studying frontier labour conditions often note that cowboys faced constant small dangers during their work. While dramatic gunfights were rare, everyday accidents sometimes proved more serious. You guide your horse carefully down the slope. The herd continues moving beneath you, their hooves pressing into the dry earth. One rider near the rear of the herd adjusts his hat and wipes sweat from his forehead. The day grows warmer. Flies gather again around the cattle, buzzing in lazy circles, before settling briefly on the animals' backs. A curious observation appears in several cattle drive diaries, describing how some cowboys developed surprising tolerance for discomfort over time. Dust, heat, sore muscles, and insects gradually became normal parts of daily life. New riders often complained at first. Veterans usually shrugged and continued working. The prairie wind moves gently through the grass again. You hear the distant call of another bird, followed by silence. The herd shifts slightly as several cattle pause to graze on a patch of thicker grass. Your horse steps forward again, guiding them back into motion with calm, steady pressure. The movement resumes. Scholars who examine the reality of cowboy life sometimes emphasize that the work required persistence rather than excitement. Long drives depended on steady attention and discipline more than dramatic heroics. Looking around the prairie, now that description feels accurate. No sudden action unfolds. No dramatic moment interrupts the quiet rhythm. Just the slow movement of cattle across endless grasslands. Yet beneath that calm surface lies constant responsibility. Hundreds of animals depend on the riders to keep them moving safely toward their destination. You settle deeper into the saddle. The sun glows bright above the plains. Dust drifts through the air once more. The herd continues its patient journey across the open frontier, and you ride beside them, watching carefully for whatever the long trail might bring next. The herd moves steadily across another wide stretch of prairie as the afternoon settles into its familiar rhythm. The sun hangs high above the plains, bright and steady, while the grass ripples softly beneath the hooves of hundreds of cattle. From a distance, the herd looks almost peaceful. Up close, you notice the constant small adjustments that keep everything together. A steer drifts toward thicker grass. Another slows unexpectedly. A third nudges its way through the herd in search of a better patch of ground. Each movement draws the quiet attention of the riders. You guide your horse slightly forward, keeping your place along the side of the herd. The saddle shifts gently beneath you as your horse walks through the grass, its ears turning occasionally toward the sounds of cattle and distant voices. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead, yet sometimes the trail crosses paths with other travellers moving through the frontier. A rider near the front of the herd lifts his hand, briefly pointing towards something on the horizon. You follow his gaze. At first, the shape looks like nothing more than a dark speck against the bright grasslands. As the herd continues forward, the shape slowly becomes clearer. A wagon. 2 horses pull it across the prairie, their pace slow but determined. The wagon appears small against the vast landscape, its wooden frame bouncing slightly over the uneven ground. Encounters like this happened occasionally on cattle trails. Many settlers travelled west during the late 19th century, crossing the same open lands used by cattle drives. Wagons carried family supplies and hopes for new lives in distant territories. Historical migration records show that thousands of families moved westward during these decades, seeking farmland opportunity or simply a different future. You watch the wagon approach slowly. The driver raises a hand in greeting as he notices the riders guiding the herd. A woman sits beside him on the wooden bench, holding a small child wrapped in a blanket. Behind them, the wagon carries bundles of supplies tied carefully beneath a canvas cover. The trail boss lifts his hand in return. The herd continues moving through. The riders guide the cattle slightly to one side, so the wagon can pass safely without startling the animals. Travellers on the frontier often shared the land in this careful way. The wagon rolls slowly past. For a moment, the settlers and cowboys observe one another with quiet curiosity. Their lives share the same landscape but follow very different paths. The wagon continues onward toward the distant horizon. The herd resumes its full spread across the prairie. You guide your horse back into position along the flank of the cattle. A curious note appears in several frontier travel journals, describing how settlers sometimes pause to watch cattle drives passing across the plains. For many travellers, the sight of thousands of cattle moving across the open land must have looked almost unbelievable. Dust rising behind the herd, riders circling the animals, the slow rolling movement of livestock stretching across miles of prairie. It must have felt like watching a living river flowing through the grass. You glance toward the horizon once more. The wagon grows smaller as it continues across the land. Encounters between cowboys and settlers were usually brief like this. Each group followed its own destination. The prairie wind moves softly again. Birds glide across the sky, circling above the herd before drifting away. The cattle continue their steady march northward. Some historians continue examining how cattle drives and westward migration occasionally intersected in complicated ways. As more settlers arrived and fences began appearing across the plains, the open range that once allowed free movement of cattle gradually began to shrink. But for now, the prairie remains mostly open. No fences interrupt the land ahead. No towns appear yet on the horizon. just grass stretching toward the sky. You settle deeper into the saddle again. The herd moves forward. Your horse steps patiently beside the drifting cattle. The riders guide the animals across the endless plains, continuing their long journey across the frontier. The wagon disappears slowly into the distance, shrinking against the wide horizon until it becomes little more than a moving dot across the grasslands. Soon even that fades, leaving the prairie once again quiet and nearly empty. The herd continues its steady progress. You ride along the flank, guiding your horse through the tall grass as the cattle move forward in a broad drifting line. The rhythm of the trail settles back into its familiar pattern. Hooves press into the ground. Grass bends beneath heavy bodies. Dust lifts gently into the warm air. After many days on the drive, time begins behaving in unusual ways. Morning turns into afternoon almost without notice. One stretch of prairie looks much like the next. Even the routine of riding, eating and resting follows nearly the same order each day. You sometimes find yourself wondering which day of the week it might be. Many accounts written by cowboys describe this strange blending of time during long drives. Without calendars or regular contact with towns, riders often measured the passing days simply by how far the herd had travelled. Miles became the only reliable clock. The sun climbs high overhead, again warming the prairie with steady heat. Your horse flicks its tail lazily at the flies circling around its flanks. Nearby a rider hums softly while guiding his horse through the grass. The tune drifts in and out of the wind, repeating in a slow, relaxed rhythm that seems to match the movement of the cattle. The prairie stretches endlessly ahead. At times, the landscape changes so gradually that you only notice it after several miles. A patch of thicker grass here, a gentle rise in the land there. Occasionally a shallow stream cuts through the prairie, its narrow banks lined with taller plants and a few scattered trees. These small differences become important landmarks along the trail. Historical maps of cattle routes reveal that trail bosses often planned their paths carefully around reliable water sources. Streams and rivers provided necessary drinking spots for the herd and resting places for the riders. Without water, a cattle drive could quickly become dangerous. You guide your horse along the edge of the herd as the cattle approach a shallow depression in the land. The ground slopes slightly downward before rising again on the far side. The herd spreads out as it crosses the dip. A few cattle pause to graze on the thicker grass growing in the low ground. You gently guide them forward again. The movement continues. A curious anecdote appears in several trail diaries, describing how some cowboys entertained themselves during long, quiet hours by naming unusual shapes in distant clouds or rock formations. Riders sometimes compared the shapes to animals' faces or entire imaginary landscapes. It may sound like a childish game, yet after days of staring at wide-open horizons, even small moments of imagination could feel refreshing. You glance toward the sky. A long, thin cloud stretches above the prairie, its shape faintly resembling the curved horns of a steer. Perhaps the riders who played those games understood something about the human need for variety. The herd continues drifting north. You notice the riders around you shifting positions occasionally, each one adjusting to the slow movements of the cattle. Teamwork remains constant on the trail. Even when the day feels uneventful, every rider watches carefully for signs of trouble. Scholars who analyse ranch operations often point out that successful cattle drives depended on maintaining steady progress rather than rushing the herd. Moving too quickly could exhaust the animals and reduce their weight before reaching market. Patience proved more valuable than speed. You wipe dust from your face with the edge of your sleeve. The sun remains bright overhead, though the breeze softens the heat slightly. Your horse continues walking patiently, its hooves brushing through grass that stretches in every direction. The prairie seems endless. Day after day, mile after mile, the herd continues its slow journey across the frontier. And somewhere within that quiet repetition, the rhythm of the trail becomes almost meditative. You ride, the cattle walk, the wind moves across the grass, and time drifts forward across the open land, one steady step at a time. By the time the sun begins its slow descent toward the western horizon again, the day has already stretched long across the prairie. The herd continues forward at the same unhurried pace that has carried it mile after mile through the open land. The rhythm of the trail feels deeply familiar now. Your horse walks steadily beneath you. The cattle drift across the grass in a wide, dark line. The prairie wind brushes softly through the land. Yet within this quiet routine, small comforts begin to stand out more clearly. You notice them now in ways you might not have earlier in the journey. The shade of your hat when the sun feels too bright. The moment when a breeze cools the back of your neck. The first sip of water during a midday pause. These small things matter on the trail. Many first-hand accounts, written by trail riders, mention how simple comforts gain new importance during long drives. A dry place to sleep, a warm meal, or even a few quiet minutes of rest could feel surprisingly valuable after hours in the saddle. You guide your horse gently around a small group of cattle that have slowed near the edge of the herd. Your horse steps easily through the grass, guiding the animals back toward the main group with calm precision. The partnership between rider and horse continues to deepen with each passing day. You lean forward slightly and pat the horse's neck. The animal flicks its ears and continues walking. Nearby, another cowboy pulls a small pouch from his pocket. He carefully rolls a cigarette and lights it while riding, shielding the flame from the breeze with one hand. The thin line of smoke drifts upward into the warm air. Tobacco appears frequently in descriptions of cowboy life. Riders often carried small pouches with them during long drives, using quiet moments to smoke while watching the herd. It was one of the few personal rituals that could easily travel along the trail. You glance across the prairie again. The sky remains wide and bright, though the sunlight has softened slightly as the afternoon begins leaning toward evening. Cattle continue moving with patient determination. Some pause briefly to pull mouthfuls of grass before stepping forward again. Others follow the herd without hesitation, their steady pace creating the slow-moving river of animals that stretches across the land. A rider near the front begins telling a joke to the cowboy beside him. You cannot hear the entire story, but the quiet laughter that follows drifts easily through the open air. Moments like this bring small bursts of energy into the long, quiet hours. A curious detail appears in several old ranch letters describing how some cowboys developed unexpected hobbies during cattle drives. A few riders practiced simple card tricks. Others whittled small pieces of wood during camp breaks, carving shapes or tools while sitting near the fire. These small activities helped break the monotony of the trail. The prairie breeze grows slightly cooler as the sun lowers. You shift in the saddle again, easing the stiffness in your back. After many days of riding, your body has learned to accept the constant motion of the horse. The discomfort never disappears entirely, but it becomes something you understand rather than something that surprises you. The herd crosses another gentle rise in the land. From the top, you can see miles of prairie stretching ahead. No towns appear yet, no railheads or distant buildings, only grass, sky and the slow-moving cattle. Historians examining the culture of cattle drives often emphasize how much patience the work required. The journey north could last several weeks, sometimes even months, depending on weather and distance. Every mile demanded the same steady attention. You glance toward the other riders once more. Each cowboy holds his position around the herd. Each horse responds quickly when needed. The trail boss rides ahead, guiding the slow progress toward the next campsite. The prairie wind moves softly through the grass again. Dust drifts gently behind the herd. And as the sun begins lowering toward the edge of the horizon, Another long quiet day on the trail moves gradually toward evening. The afternoon light begins softening again as the sun lowers toward the distant horizon. Long shadows stretch across the prairie behind the herd, turning the landscape into bands of gold and deep green. The cattle continue their slow, steady march. From where you ride along the flank, the herd resembles a moving landscape of horns' backs and drifting dust. The rhythm of the drive remains calm and deliberate, shaped by many days of repetition, yet the prairie itself is beginning to change. At first, the difference appears subtle. You notice it in the distance, where a faint line cuts across the grasslands. As the herd approaches, the line slowly becomes clearer. A fence. Long stretches of wire and wooden posts run across the prairie, dividing the open land into separate parcels. This sight would have been rare only a few decades earlier. For much of the 19th century, cattle moved freely across enormous areas of unfenced range. Ranchers allowed herds to graze across wide territories, relying on cowboys to gather and guide cattle when needed. However, by the 1880s, the landscape of the American West was gradually changing. Barbed wire had begun spreading across the plains, allowing ranchers and settlers to mark the boundaries of their land more clearly. The invention of inexpensive barbed wire in the 1870s made fencing large areas practical for the first time. The trail boss notices the fence line ahead. He guides the herd slightly to the side, following a path that runs parallel to the barrier rather than attempting to cross it. Fences created new challenges for cattle drives. While open prairie allowed herds to move freely, fenced land forced riders to navigate carefully through gates or around property boundaries. You ride closer to the herd as the cattle begin drifting toward the fence. Your horse steps forward quickly, guiding a few curious steers away from the wire. The animals hesitate before turning back toward the herd. Horses often reacted more quickly than riders in situations like this. Years of working cattle helped them recognize when animals might become tangled in fences or wander into dangerous areas. A curious story appears in one old ranch diary describing a particularly stubborn steer that managed to push through a barbed wire fence during a drive. According to the writer, the animal emerged on the other side with only minor scratches, but left the riders scrambling to repair the broken wire. Events like that were inconvenient at best and costly at worst. The herd continues along the fence line. The wire glints faintly in the afternoon sunlight as it stretches across the prairie. Wooden posts stand at regular intervals, forming a boundary that did not exist for earlier generations of cowboys. Some scholars examining the history of the open range suggest that the spread of fencing marked the gradual end of the classic cattle drive era. As more land became privately enclosed, long-distance drives across open prairie became more complicated. Watching the fence beside the herd, now you sense that change. The prairie still feels enormous. Yet small signs of settlement appear more frequently. Occasionally a distant farmhouse stands on the horizon. Sometimes a windmill turns slowly beside a watering trough. Each sign suggests that the frontier is slowly becoming more organised and divided. The cattle walk calmly beside the fence. Dust rises gently from their hooves as they move. You guide your horse through another wide circle along the herd's edge, keeping the animals from drifting too close to the wire. The afternoon breeze moves through the grass again. Birds circle overhead, gliding quietly above the slow-moving cattle. The trail boss rides ahead, scanning the land for the next place where the herd can cross safely or continue north without interruption. Historians sometimes debate whether cowboys at the time fully understood how quickly their way of life was changing. Some riders likely saw fences as simple obstacles along the trail. Others may have realised that the open range itself was slowly disappearing. For now, though, the herd continues its patient journey. The fence runs beside the trail for several miles before finally fading into the distance. Beyond it, the prairie opens wide once more. You guide your horse forward, returning to your place along the herd. The cattle drift across the grass. The sun sinks lower toward evening, and the long trail north continues across the changing landscape of the American West. The fence line slowly disappears behind the herd as the prairie opens wide once again. Grasslands stretch outward in every direction, rolling gently toward the distant horizon beneath the fading light of afternoon. The cattle continue forward. Their movement remains slow and patient, the familiar rhythm that has carried the herd across so many miles of open land. Hooves brush through the grass while dust drifts lazily into the warm air. You ride along the flank, watching the animals carefully. After weeks on the trail, the herd behaves with surprising discipline. The cattle move together with fewer sudden wanderings, as though they have learned the routine of the journey, just as the riders have. The trail boss signals quietly from the front of the herd. You follow his gaze toward the horizon. At first you see only grass and sky. Then a faint dark shape appears in the distance. A line of buildings. The railhead town. The sight sends a quiet ripple of excitement through the riders. For many cowboys, reaching the railhead marked the end of weeks of hard work. It meant the cattle would soon be delivered to buyers and loaded onto trains bound for distant markets. The journey would finally reach its conclusion. A well-documented historical fact about cattle drives is that railheads played a crucial role in the cattle industry of the late 19th century. Towns such as Abilene, Dodge City, and other rail hubs became gathering points where cattle could be shipped north and east to growing cities. These towns grew quickly as cattle drives brought thousands of animals and large numbers of cowboys into the area each season. The herd continues its steady approach. The buildings grow slightly clearer with each mile. You can see the outline of wooden structures now clustered along the distant tracks where trains pass through the prairie. Smoke rises faintly from one of the chimneys. The sight of civilization after so many days on open land feels almost unreal. The riders around you seem to sense it as well. Conversation begins drifting more frequently across the herd. Someone mentions the possibility of fresh food once the cattle are delivered. Another cowboy jokes about finding the nearest saloon before sunset. Even the horses appear slightly more energetic, stepping forward with renewed enthusiasm. Yet the work is not finished. The herd must still reach the town safely. You guide your horse closer to the cattle as a few steers begin drifting toward a patch of grass beside the trail. Your horse steps calmly into their path, turning them back toward the main group. The herd moves forward again. A curious observation recorded in several frontier newspapers described how townspeople often gathered along the streets when large cattle drives arrived. Watching thousands of cattle moving through town streets must have been an impressive sight for residents unaccustomed to such scenes. Dust rising, cowboys riding along the herd. The deep rumble of hooves echoing between wooden buildings. The town ahead continues growing larger. You can see more details now. Wooden storefronts. A water tower near the rail line. The faint outline of wagons moving along the main street. The prairie wind carries a distant sound. Perhaps a hammer striking metal. Perhaps the distant whistle of a locomotive. Historians still examine how cattle drive towns developed their reputations so quickly during this era. Some towns became famous for lively nightlife and rowdy celebrations when cowboys arrived after long drives. Others tried to maintain stricter order to keep business stable. The truth probably varied from place to place. The herd continues its steady approach. Dust rises behind the animals as they walk. Your horse steps patiently beside them, guiding the cattle through the final miles of their journey. The sun begins lowering toward the horizon. Evening light spreads across the prairie, casting long shadows that stretch toward the distant town. After weeks of riding across open land, the end of the drive finally appears within reach. The herd moves forward. The riders guide them carefully, and the quiet frontier town waits ahead at the end of the long trail. The town grows slowly larger as the herd approaches across the prairie. What first appeared as a distant smudge on the horizon now reveals individual buildings, wooden roofs, and narrow streets cutting through the small settlement. The cattle continue forward with their steady, unhurried pace. Weeks of travel have carried them across hundreds of miles of open land, and now the journey is nearly finished. Dust rises behind their hooves in soft drifting clouds as the herd moves closer to the edge of town. You guide your horse carefully along the flank. Even near the end of the drive, attention remains important. A herd this large must be guided slowly through the final miles to avoid confusion or panic near the unfamiliar sights and sounds of the settlement. The riders around you spread out slightly wider. Each cowboy watches a section of cattle guiding animals that will wander too far from the main group. The horses step forward with calm familiarity, responding quickly to small movements from their riders. The town becomes clearer with each passing minute. Wooden storefronts line a dusty street that runs beside the railroad tracks. A few wagons move slowly between buildings. Smoke rises from chimneys, where evening fires have already been lit. People begin appearing along the edges of town. Some stand outside stores. Others gather beside the road to watch the approaching herd. Cattle drives were major events for frontier towns. Thousands of animals arriving at once meant business for merchants, rail workers, and cattle buyers who waited to purchase the herd. Historical records from railhead towns indicate that these arrivals often created busy and noisy scenes. Cowboys, merchants, buyers, and townspeople all gathered as herds entered the settlement. For now, though, the herd remains just outside the town limits. The trail boss raises his hand and signals for the riders to slow the cattle even further. This final approach requires patience. Sudden movement could frighten the herd if unfamiliar sounds or crowds appear too quickly. Your horse walks calmly through the grass beside the cattle. Ahead you notice the railroad tracks stretching across the prairie like a thin, dark line. Beside them stands a long wooden platform where livestock will soon be loaded into railcars. The sight of the railroad carries a strange feeling. The entire purpose of the cattle drive leads to this moment. Once the herd reaches the railhead, trains will carry the animals far beyond the frontier to markets in distant cities. A curious story from one old newspaper describes how some early cowboys reacted with amazement when they first saw large steam locomotives up close. After weeks on quiet prairie trails, the sound and power of the machines seemed almost unbelievable. You can imagine the experience. The whistle of a train echoing across the plains. The rumble of iron wheels on the tracks. It must have felt like the future arriving suddenly in the middle of the frontier. The herd continues moving toward the loading area. Riders guide the cattle carefully into a wide holding pen built from wooden rails. The animals step through the gate, slowly filling the enclosure with the familiar sounds of breathing and shifting hooves. Dust settles gradually as the movement stops. For the first time in many days, the herd no longer travels forward. The long drive has ended. You guide your horse toward the edge of the pen and dismount. Your legs feel stiff after the final hours in the saddle, though the sensation fades as you walk a few steps across the ground. Around you, the other riders do the same. Some remove their hats and wipe dust from their faces. Others stretch their arms and backs after the long journey. The cattle settle into the pen. Their slow breathing fills the evening air. Some historians studying the cattle industry note that this moment often carried mixed emotions for cowboys. Delivering the herd meant the work was complete, but it also meant the end of the familiar rhythm that had guided daily life on the trail. You glance back toward the prairie. The open land stretches wide behind you, glowing softly beneath the setting sun. For weeks the herd moves steadily across that landscape. Now the journey has come to a quiet stop, and as the evening light spreads across the railhead town, you begin wondering what comes next after the long trail finally ends. The evening settles gently over the railhead town. The sun lowers behind the distant prairie, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of amber and fading blue. The cattle stand quietly inside the large wooden pens beside the railroad tracks, their long journey across the plains finally complete. You stand near the fence, for a moment resting one hand on the rough wooden rail. The herd breathes slowly around you. Some cattle lower their heads to nibble at scattered grass inside the enclosure. Others stand still, tired after weeks of walking across the open range. The restless motion that once carried them mile after mile has softened into calm stillness. Behind you, the small frontier town begins preparing for night. Lanterns flicker to life in windows along the main street. A wagon rattles slowly across the dusty road. Somewhere nearby, a hammer taps softly against metal as a worker finishes a last task before darkness settles fully. The railroad platform stretches beside the pens, quiet for now. Soon the cattle buyers will arrive. Tomorrow the herd will be loaded into railcars and carried far away to distant cities. That moment will belong to someone else. Your work as a trail cowboy is already finished. Historical records from the late 19th century show that many cattle drives ended exactly like this. After delivering the herd to the railhead, cowboys received their pay and prepared for whatever came next. Some riders stayed in town for a few days before searching for another drive. Others returned to ranch work or drifted toward new opportunities along the frontier. The trail rarely kept anyone forever. You lean against the fence and look back toward the prairie. Beyond the town, the land stretches wide and quiet beneath the fading light. Grasslands ripple softly in the evening wind, the same endless landscape that carried the herd north across so many days. Out there, the trail still exists, a long path of memory stretching through the open range. Some historians suggest that many cowboys developed a deep attachment to that landscape. Riding for weeks across the plains created a kind of familiarity with the land that few other people experienced. The prairie became more than scenery. It became part of the rhythm of life. You take a slow breath. The air smells different here near the town. Smoke from cooking fires drifts through the evening breeze. Faint sounds of conversation rise from the street beyond the railroad yard. Civilization feels close again. A curious observation appears in several personal letters written by former trail riders. Some cowboys admitted that after long drives they sometimes missed the quiet routine of the open range more than they expected. The towns felt crowded. The nights felt louder. The sky felt smaller. Out on the prairie, the world seemed simpler. You watch the last light fade from the horizon. The stars begin appearing one by one above the town, just as they did out on the trail. The same sky stretches overhead, unchanged by fences or railroads. Your horse stands nearby, grazing quietly beside the pen. The animal seems calm, perhaps as tired as you feel after the long drive. You walk over and rest your hand along its neck for a moment. The horse exhales softly. Together you both stand quietly in the cool evening air. The long journey across the prairie is finished now. No more dawn rides guiding the herd through tall grass. No more slow afternoons watching the horizon for storms. No more quiet night watches beneath the wide open sky. Those moments belong to the trail behind you, but the memory of them remains. You remember the early mornings when the prairie woke slowly beneath pale sunlight, the endless miles of grass bending in the wind, the quiet songs drifting across the herd during calm nights, the steady rhythm of hooves and saddle leather, all of it fading now into the peaceful distance of memory. The town grows quieter as night settles fully. Lantern light glows softly along the street. A distant train whistle echoes across the prairie, long and low, drifting through the darkness. You take one last look toward the open land beyond the rail yard. The prairie rests beneath the stars just as it always has. And as the night deepens around you, the long story of the trail gently fades into silence. The sounds of the town drift farther away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of the evening settling across the prairie. The cattle in the pens breathe slowly. The horses rest in the grass beside the rail yard. Even the distant whistle of the train fades into memory. You feel the long journey finally releasing its hold. Your muscles relax. Your breathing slows. The long days of riding across open land begin to blur into peaceful images that drift gently through your mind. Miles of grasslands glowing beneath the morning sun. The quiet hum of cowboys singing softly beside the herd at night. The slow creak of saddle leather moving in rhythm with a walking horse. All of it blending together into the calm rhythm of the trail. Out on the prairie, the wind moves through the tall grass like a quiet lullaby. The stars continue shining above the endless horizon, and somewhere beyond the town, the open range stretches peacefully beneath the night sky. There is nothing left to guide, no cattle to watch, no long miles waiting ahead, only the calm stillness of the prairie resting under the stars. So let the quiet settle around you now. Let the long trail fade into the distance, and let the gentle rhythm of the frontier carry you softly into sleep. Sweet dreams.